Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Kill Your Heroes in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Kill Your Heroes. Chapter 21. Counterphobia. Sakura left when Kakashi-sensei did, though the enormous, ugly bruise across her shoulder blades protested her decision. It was still preferable to the unnerving feeling that at any moment someone might appear at her door and make the windowless, sterile room her grave. To marry, despite Kakashi-sensei's assurances. To Mary's teammate, with the soulless eyes and all that crushing sand. Orochimaru. That thought made her walk a little closer to Kakashi-sensei, her gaze skittering nervously over the people they passed in the halls. He could be anyone, the paranoid part of her brain insisted, to which the rational part retorted, "You aren't worth the trouble." She tried to believe the rational voice, but she was still raw from the inexplicable turn of events in the forest of death. Nothing in her career seemed to be going as it should, so why would this be anything different? "Sakura, if I stop suddenly, I'm going to have to peel you off my elbow," Kakashi-sensei said wryly. "I wasn't going to interrogate you like I did the boys, but I'm listening if there's something you want to tell me." She worried her lip, sparing one last anxious glance around the entrance as they left the tower, which seemed even more ominous with the on-site medical facilities, then rapidly recounted everything that had happened in the forest in a voice that was hardly more than a whisper. The Jounin were keeping a corridor out of the forest clear of predators, which made their exit much easier than the journey in, and there was nothing to distract her from her story. Kakashi-sensei was silent until she'd finished, which was just as well, because once she started talking, she couldn't seem to stop. She had to swipe at her eyes with the palm of her hand, but it wasn't just fear, but also rage and frustration and disappointment, all tangled together. Not just Orochimaru, but Naruto, and Sasuke and all the rest. Even though she'd tried hard to swallow back the bitterness, it felt so good to finally say it aloud. Her breathing was slightly ragged when she'd finished, but she'd never raised her voice, not once. And while there'd been tears, she hadn't outright cried either, even though telling Kakashi-sensei about being inside the mouth of the snake had been like relieving it. Her excellent memory, so useful elsewhere, kept supplying the scent and the sound and the feel of it, her stomach clenching reflexively at that weightless, waiting for the pain moments of being suspended in space. But she'd soldiered through, came to the tower and to Mary and brought it to a clean end. Now she glanced up nervously at Kakashi-sensei, who was frowning intently, but when he noticed her attention he raised his brows in that sardonic way of his, twisting his mouth into a wry grin. "Let's just agree that when you retake the exam, you don't go so far out of your way to impress S-class missing nin." "Impress?" "I sealed Sasuke's little memento and Orochimaru came calling after I'd finished." Didn't seem too perturbed by the sealing, which was a little unsettling, but he had good things to say about you. Sakura was at first dubious, because Kakashi-sensei taught life lessons by exposing genin to horrifying genjutsu, but then she realized he was serious. It felt like every fine hair on her body stood to attention in its follicle, because being mentioned by Orochimaru meant being taken notice of by Orochimaru. That was high on her list of do not want, because it seemed to stand in opposition to her immediate life goal, which was live another day. She clasped her forearm hard enough to hurt, gritting her teeth against the shudder that racked her body. "That's really bad, Kakashi-sensei." "I agree. But it didn't sound like he was interested in recruiting you, if that's any comfort. We'll have to keep an eye on Sasuke, though." The dubiousness returned as she glanced sidelong at Kakashi-sensei. "Don't worry," he reassured her. "I'm not asking you to engage Orochimaru in a fight, just to make certain that Sasuke runs." "How?" "He only listens to Naruto," she muttered. "Genjutsu if you have to," was Kakashi-sensei's immediate reply. "Rest assured, whatever you show him will be much, much preferable to what Orochimaru is capable of." Sakura thought through the implications of that her hell viewing jutsu was preferable, and was not reassured by this permission to turn her techniques against her teammate. But, she reassured herself, for the next month, it was Kakashi-sensei's responsibility to watch after Sasuke. And someone else's to look after Naruto. Perhaps after that, her anger might have faded, Naruto once again merely irritating and Sasuke well, she hoped that one day she'd glance over at him and not the exultant expression on his face as he broke Zuko's arm. Kill your heroes. The Ninken had at least allowed her to return home and shower after their morning walk, since she was scheduled to meet her interim sensei and wanted to make an impression that did not involve mud and dog slobber. The dog hair was a lost cause, so she ignored the way her clothing below her waist seemed to accumulate it like it had magnetic properties. She was down to only Bull and Pakun, the latter of whom catching a ride on the larger dog's head, while Bull had his mouth full of a scroll case. "Instructions for your feeding and care," Pakun said when he noticed the direction of her gaze. "Kakashi-sensei didn't tell my mentor what he wanted him or her to teach me himself." "That's not the boss's way," Pakun said. "This way, if there's something they don't like, they don't have a chance to argue with it. At least not in person." "Kakashi-sensei, the path to conservation of effort," Sakura remarked dryly, which caused Pakun to chuckle. "That's about the way of it." "So who is my sensei?" she prodded. "That would be telling, kid. Besides, we're almost there." Almost There was a neat little eatery that Kakashi-sensei had tricked her into treating him at, once, the memory of which made her scowl as she came in the door and was welcomed by the wait staff. There were latticed screens separating the booths, which leaned everything had an air of privacy, but made it hard to pick out anyone even if she'd known who she was looking for. Luckily, Bull seemed to know the way, and the eatery, like most places that catered to ninja, had a relaxed policy when it came to ninja animals. Their destination turned out to be a booth in the back corner with a view of both doors, the paranoia stall, as it was teasing referred to, though beneath the humor was a tacit understanding that that seat belonged to whichever jounin was the first to be seated. Kakashi-sensei apparently felt that unobstructed views of the exits were overrated. His requirement was good light and quick service, which usually saw them seated at the bar or near the kitchen. The jounin seated at the booth was occupied with chatting up the waitress as they approached, so they had to wait until she'd taken her leave before Sakura could duck into a neat bow and introduce herself. There was a beat as the jounin considered her, the senbon in his mouth flicking almost irritably, something echoed by the furrow of his brow. But then it smoothed out and she was left with a sardonically grin that seemed more earnest than Kakashi-sensei's expression. "Genma Shiranui," he introduced himself. "Kakashi called in some favors and uncollected bets, and I'm in the village to provide extra manpower for the duration of the exams anyway, so here I am. Sit." He indicated the bench opposite him with a tilt of his head, and Sakura nervously seated herself. "I took a look at your records already and I know all about your performance in the exams. Perfect score on the first section, a loss in the second that was avenged in a nasty way. But I don't know what exactly Kakashi wants me to teach you." That was Bull's cue to plop the scroll case on the table, and after looking in distaste at the drool-slick surface, Genma-sensei opened it. His eyebrows swept up as he unrolled it, which Sakura felt didn't bode well, but it was Kakashi-sensei. She hadn't expected anything else. Frankly speaking, if there was a chance she'd be meeting with Orochimaru again, she'd take twice his usual torture and like it. "Shit," Genma-sensei said with feeling. "He's got a list of assigned readings in here as long as my arm. Some of them you need to be a jounin just to take out of the archives. Real heavy on chakra theory and manipulation and genjutsu, looks like, and enough anatomy texts to qualify you as a hunter nin in Mizu. As for physical training, looks like you'll be working with his dogs in the morning for stamina training, which is good. I'm not a morning person. Work on your knife work, alright. Wants to press your limits with your projectile weapons, says your aim degrades too much when you're working at speed. Again, pretty basic. What is not basic, and really is just this side of crazy, is that he wants you to be able to do full speed shunshin by the time I return you to him. Is shunshin that unusual?" Sakura asked timidly. "For your first year out of the academy? If you're any kind of prodigy, maybe not, but this seems like it might be a little much for you." "Sakura is already capable of the basic movement," Pakun replied. "She just needs work on fine-tuning her chakra manipulation so that when she enhances her ability to perceive rapid movement she doesn't fry her ocular nerve in the process." "Really?" Genma-sensei asked skeptically. Because that wasn't in, his voice trailed off and then he shook his head ruefully. "Sorry, Sakura," he apologized. "I should know better than to expect Kakashi to be completely explicit in your personnel files. He's a cagey bastard with his own abilities, no need to expect anything different when it comes to your record keeping. A little more thorough on your teammates, but there's more people looking over his shoulder when it comes to them." His lips quirked up like that was a joke, but Sakura couldn't follow his humor. I don't know when he expects you to sleep with this kind of workload, but we'll do our best. But first, breakfast. Working with Genma-sensei turned out to be a very different experience from working with Kakashi-sensei. His humor was less edged, less sardonic, and more abundant, which made learning under him more like exercises out of the academy and less like Kakashi-sensei's prepare you for life if you survive it style that had become the norm for their sessions since Wave. But Genma was also very good at what he did, at least on the armed and unarmed combat side of things, though he readily confessed to being good only at breaking genjutsu. Which was fine. He hadn't been lying when he'd talked about Kakashi-sensei's reading list, much of which had to be tackled with note paper and dictionary in hand, even if most of them were short treatises rather than full-size books. But this was one area at least where Sakura had complete confidence and she enjoyed the challenge to her mind, setting to her assignments with a pleasure she didn't usually feel when doing physical training. Her motto for that was more suffering today, for less suffering tomorrow, but she was greedy for the knowledge. Even when that knowledge was endless diagrams of eyes and chakra flow and all the ways she could end up permanently blinding herself when using Shunshin if she misdirected the flow even fractionally or kept up the enhancement too long. They were more than midway through the month when Genma-sensei was called away during one of their training sessions and Sakura knew something was wrong when he sent a note calling off the rest of the lesson. Unlike Kakashi-sensei, Genma-sensei, for all his humor, took his responsibilities very seriously. It had been strangely unnerving to have her sensei arrive before her to their training field. Because she didn't receive any word to the contrary, she showed up at their training field on time and found a strangely sober Genma-sensei waiting for her. But he wasn't alone. "Hey, Sakura," he greeted her. "Genma-sensei." Genma-sensei's senbon flicked as he considered her, then he sighed. "All right, I've been checking out books under my name and letting you use them. I suppose I can trust you to be circumspect. We had an incident last night. Hey, he's the one who proctored the selection round after the second round is dead. And I've been appointed proctor of the third exam, which means I'll be taking on extra duties. Ergo, less time for you. But, Rado has agreed to lend some of his time and help us out. He'll be training you with your knives." He grinned. "It's about the only thing he's better than me at, so we have to let him enjoy the chance to show off when it comes around." The other man Rado rolled his eyes silently. He was one of the few jounin Sakura had ever seen with facial scarring, well-healed but with thick ridges of scar tissue that swept across the bridge of his nose and widened in their path along his cheek. Otherwise he had a certain no-nonsense sort of look, his hair cropped short and with no personal modifications to his uniform. "I'll be in your care," Sakura said politely. Rado nodded. "From what Genma tells me, you're easy to work with. My specialty is Kenjutsu, so I can give you a good grounding in how to approach an opponent using a blade with superior reach. I didn't have any notice, so I didn't have time to clear my mission schedule. You'll have occasional afternoons to yourself if you want my recommendation, fill them up with D-ranks instead of more training. I've seen your schedule. You don't want to burn yourself out and more missions to flesh out your resume will do you good in the future." Sakura took his advice and all his lessons to heart. She wasn't fond of him the same way she was of Genma-sensei, because he was as sober and professional as some of the guest lecturers at the academy, more interested in imparting his knowledge than building any sort of connection. Somehow, that made her even more aware that she was taking up his time and she worked hard to not disappoint him. He made her work hard for it. He'd said his specialization was Kenjutsu, which was true, but he hadn't clarified that he was best known as an assassin. There was little of what she thought of as sword fighting in his style, which was bare of all flash and spare to the point of frankness. She spent most of their practices being killed in a single blow, Rado-sensei methodically exploiting every weakness in her defenses. And then just as patiently breaking down what she'd done wrong and what she'd need to do instead. It was almost like being at the academy again, except with the personalized attention that a natural teacher's pet like Sakura had always craved and competed for. It almost made being a shinobi fun again, helped her paranoia to ease, though every night reminded her exactly why she trained so hard each day. The newest nightmares did not get better, precisely, but just as she'd found with Wave, she grew better at managing them. Trying not to sleep just made them creep into her waking hours and made her sloppy besides, so she learned all sorts of tricks to fall asleep, to stay asleep, and to fall back asleep when the second didn't work out. She was careful not to work herself to exhaustion just before bed, which made the dreams more vivid, and she sometimes regarded those moments of panicked waking with a dark sort of humor. She'd never had more practice controlling her breathing and easing her heart rate. She didn't hear anything from Kakashi-sensei or her teammates during the month, and she didn't have enough spare time to spend stoking her grudge. It dissipated, the heat of her former anger cooled, though her feelings never quite returned to their original state. Naruto was just irritating, he was dangerous, and while Sasuke was beautiful, she couldn't help but wonder about that flash of cruelty. How much of it was Orochimaru and how much was Sasuke? Sakura did meet others. Ino, sporting ugly, slow-healing bruises that testified that Zuko hadn't spared her face, hadn't come to brag about her victory. She'd come instead to tentatively broach the idea of rekindling their friendship. I looked at you down there in the arena and I saw the same stranger I met before when I first saw that scar, you know, and I felt like I was losing to you, somehow. I didn't like that, she admitted frankly, which was so Ino that Sakura was back on the academy's lawn during their lunch break. So I couldn't lose my match, no matter what that freak did. I have you to thank for that, Sakura. Ino didn't ask her about how she'd gotten the scar and Sakura didn't volunteer. Too much of their closeness had been lost and Sakura was too aware that Ino hadn't had a wave yet, hadn't had a mission take her to the edge and bring her back a different person than when she'd arrived. One day, maybe, they'd be best friends again. Until then, she was content to let Ino fashion pick at her outfit and her shemug. It was the first time in a long time that she'd had a conversation that was only peripherally related to her ability to kill someone. Her other visitor was more alarming and less vocal. Gaara, Temeri's teammate. Not a single word had been exchanged between them, but she'd been left with the impression it might have been a whole conversation to Gaara. She had no idea what he'd taken from it. His lack of eyebrows made him even more inscrutable than those eyes alone managed. And then her month was at an end and it was time to be a part of Team 7 once again. Kill Your Heroes. Chapter 22. Ichnophobia, Part I. Her hair was still damp from the shower when Sakura made her way the arena, nibbling gleefully at a stick of syrup-coated Anko Dango. She'd never known a true calorie deficit until she'd met the Ninken, but nowadays she ate more than she had before just to maintain her weight. And what weight she did have was beginning to be distributed differently, lean muscle reshaping her arms, legs, and abdomen. Sakura hadn't been precisely out of shape before, but the day in, day out conditioning had changed not only what her body was capable of, but what she thought her body was capable of. That in turn inspired a certain amount of confidence as she passed beneath the guest entrance. Perhaps she wouldn't stand on that field today, but she no longer felt herself to be so deeply unequal to most of them. Just most she could take 20 years and not feel equal to doing anything more than running from Gaara. But she had one significant advantage on the competitors: she could enjoy the vendors that had turned out in force as the wealthy and the curious of 4 countries turned out for a rare exhibition match. She was also clean, put together, and likely to stay that way. Just days before she'd finally been in to see the specialist and she no longer had the scar on her face staring at her every time she looked in the mirror. There'd been a strange, faint tinge of regret when she'd seen it absent on her skin, when she hadn't felt the faint tug of it when she smiled, but it had been nearly buried by the relief of no longer having that visible reminder of wave. She already carried quite enough of those. She followed the directions of the ninja on crowd control and maneuvered her way through the civilians crowding the stairways until she came down to the front rows, which had been reserved for shinobi. The idea being that though the competitors were expected to have the common sense not to use attacks that could injure someone in the stands, they all understood that competition affected judgment and therefore were forming ranks of human shields in front of the daimyo and diplomats who might be understandably perturbed by a stray kunao. The stands were already filling and Sakura was trying to pick out someone familiar to sit by, not having much success at it. With Ino and the rest of Team 7 in the final round, she was left with few options among people who own age, transitioning directly from crippling shyness to being the best friend of the most popular and capable kunoichi in their class hadn't earned her many friends. And she didn't know many older shinobi. Genma-sensei was proctoring and Rado-sensei would spend the day serving as Hokage-sama's aide. She was beginning to think she should have invited the Ninkin along to keep her company when Sakura came to an odd realization. Before, the idea of sitting alone, the implication she didn't have anyone to sit with, that she didn't belong to a group, would have made her chest tight with anxiety. To a preteen girl and maybe a preteen boy, for all she knew, not belonging anywhere was worse than belonging to a group that treated you badly. Now, that all seemed so petty. What did it matter that she was sitting alone? She'd killed alone, fought alone, trained alone. So she chose a seat with a view she liked, helped herself to another stick of dango, and settled in for the competition. If the stranger at her elbow she'd chosen an aisle seat made her uncomfortable, it wasn't any sense of social embarrassment any longer, just an unhealthy paranoia that was still dogging her through her nights and into her days. She would never admit to anyone that those first few nights back from the forest she'd shoved her bed just far enough away from the wall for her to slip into the crevice, feeling safer sleeping there, for all that her tactical mind knew that it might limit her mobility if someone actually attacked her in her own home. But there was too much ambient noise and energy surrounding her for her to slip into herself. Even the shinobi were excited by the prospect of the competition. This year was heavy on names that carried a certain weight: the last of the Uchiha, the prodigy of the Hyuga, the demon come up out of the desert. Everyone else might have been window dressing for their matches, especially as they were guaranteed a match between the first and the last, and the odds were heavily favoring the winner of that match to face the Hyuga in the finals. Sakura couldn't disagree, given what she'd seen, but something like odds wouldn't stop Naruto from beating his head against a brick wall until the wall bled. The third round opened with Tenten and Rock Lee, who'd taken the exhibition to heart, giving the audience an intense display of shinobi technical skill without serious aggression driving their fight. And they didn't throw themselves at each other recklessly either, each clearly pacing themselves in anticipation of several more rounds. No point in winning the first round if you faced chakra exhaustion at the beginning of the second. For a long time, it looked like it could go either way, and then Lee made some move she couldn't quite follow with her eyes, and Tenten was down, his hand at her throat in an echo of his signature opening stance. When Genma-sensei called the match in Lee's favor, Sakura could just make out a rueful smile on Tenten's face as Lee shifted his hand away from her throat and pulled her to her feet. Her hand clapped down on Lee's shoulder in a friendly gesture, and her body language made the short exchange that followed look like encouragement. It was nice, Sakura decided, to see a team who could enter into even a high-stakes competition like this and still treat each other with respect. Of all the things they'd displayed on the field, that impressed her the most. Team 7 wouldn't have been able to replicate that, not for all their Shuriganais and impossible chakra reserves. The match that followed it was about as unlike the first as it could be without actual homicidal intent. Hyuga all cool dignity while Naruto shouted, and raged, and seethed. She was glad she couldn't make out exactly what he was saying, because while time had tempered her resentment, she hadn't forgotten what she'd felt as Hinata picked herself up again and again and flung herself against an enemy she wasn't skilled enough to beat. Tell her it's enough, she'd wanted to shout. Tell her it's alright to quit. Tell her she doesn't have to hurt for someone else's hate. Some part of her knew that Naruto had only wanted Hinata to stand up for herself, to defend her pride and her skills, but what would it mean to absolutely commit yourself like that and lose anyway? But whatever impact that match had had on Hinata, whatever effect all that impassioned yelling had on Neji, it was Naruto who won the match. The next match was slated to be Sasuke's, but he still hadn't made an appearance. There was a sharp fragment of worry there, but a stronger sense that he was with Kakashi-sensei, who would probably be late to his own funeral, told her that they were just late. Shikamaru's match followed on the heels of the announcement that they would postpone the highly anticipated battle between Sasuke and Gaara. Given the nature of the match that followed, Sakura thought it would have been disappointing for the civilians even if they hadn't been anticipating anything else. Much like Kakashi-sensei, but without his flair or his ability to goad others into doing what he wanted them to do, Shikamaru would expend exactly enough effort to meet his goals and no more. In the academy, that had mostly been passing grades except on multiple choice tests, which didn't involve nearly as much effort as essays. She couldn't help but think that some sort of bribery was involved, to keep him in this match when he looked so plainly apathetic. But not enough, apparently, to secure the effort for a second round. It was frustrating to watch the opponent who'd beaten her be handed her victory by someone who just didn't care enough to take it, but it was clear by the expression on Tamari's face that she found it infuriating. And she thought, good, but there wasn't the vehemence there that she'd felt in Naruto's match against Neji. Paranoia had turned to a faint sense of shame, because she'd tried to kill her and Temari, probably knowing that, had refrained from doing the same. She'd judged someone by their teammate, which was a stupid thing to do. It was part of the reason she'd hated being slotted into a squad with Naruto, because she'd known that what people thought of her would be tainted by what they thought of him. She wasn't Naruto. And Temari wasn't Gaara. She was glad when the two of them cleared the field and Ino and Shino took it. Sakura cheered for Ino, even though she was aware it was a bad match for her skill set since she wouldn't be willing to kill Shino's Kikaicho, devastating his colony being far more traumatic than destroying his favorite Kunao. Ino lost, but she did it with style, collapsing dramatically to her knees as a cloud of chakra-eating bugs lifted from her shoulders, not bloodied and bruised and beaten, but seemingly untouched. If she had to lose in a public arena like this kind of ending was the kind best suited to Ino, especially when she tried to stand and her legs almost collapsed again and both Genma-sensei and Shino moved to catch her. Ino had always been the heroine in her own story. She'd come to the academy with a team waiting for her, tailored for generations to support her skills. Her skills had been unquestionable, from sparring matches to flower arrangement, coupled with, if not perfect social grace, then a real sense of her own place in their little microcosm. A kind of social command, Sakura would have called it. She might not have been universally liked, but no one made fun of Yamanaka Ino. There was a distant regret in Sakura that she would never be that girl, but the resentment was gone, as if her subconscious had finally recognized she no longer had a place in that story. She felt freer for it. Sadder, but freer. And then came Sasuke. The last-second entrance, his hair settling from an assisted shunshin, back-to-back with a shinobi infamous the continent over everything was so perfectly calculated to heighten the drama of the moment that she knew Kakashi-sensei was behind it. Why Kakashi-sensei was behind it was another question, because it would have been perfectly in character for him to simply amble in at the last minute, wave Sasuke on his way, and go back to reading his nasty novel. Maybe, her eyes slid over to the Hokage's balcony, maybe he was late to give everyone else a chance to fight the first round without being overshadowed by this match. Or maybe, she thought more wryly an instant later, Kakashi-sensei couldn't resist the urge to mess with this many people at the same time with so little effort on his part. That one was far less noble, but far more likely. Yo! Kakashi-sensei greeted her, suddenly lounging on the divider rail, hands tucked in his pockets. Did you forget to set your alarm this morning, Kakashi-sensei? Sakura asked dryly. Because the Ninken slobber setting was working just fine on mine. Kakashi-sensei chuckled. Considerate practice for your first boyfriend. He too will wake you hours before you're ready just to slobber. Sasuke would not dash, Sakura retorted automatically before her brain processed the DPO. Kakashi-sensei. She hissed, ears burning a bright, embarrassed pink. Her reprimand only made him chuckle again. I suppose we should actually watch, he said laconically, turning back toward the arena. Given the amount of effort Sasuke put into his training, Sakura had been willing to be distracted from the match itself, had carefully shoved it into a dark corner of her mind and thrown a blanket over it. To her, Gaara was more monster-made flesh than a fellow shinobi. She'd seen his sand, how easily and effortlessly he manipulated it, seen how little life meant to him. Dosu hadn't been an opponent, he'd been an annoyance, crushed more easily than swatting a fly and with as little remorse. She didn't want to imagine Sasuke fighting him, because for all Sasuke's skill, she wasn't certain it would be a fight. If you keep frowning like that, you'll have wrinkles by the time you're 20, Kakashi-sensei chided her. I'm deeply hurt by your lack of faith. You didn't think I was just going to let Sasuke loose against Gaara without giving him a chance, did you? You only had a month, Sakura murmured skeptically. Ah, but there are massive shortcuts that can be taken in training when you factor in a Sharingan. Especially when that month was spent on two things and two things only. A weapon capable of piercing that sand and the speed he'll need to use it. Oh? That's a lot of confidence you have in your student, Kakashi. Sakura flinched as another Jounin-sensei, appeared on the steps above Kakashi-sensei. Not only had she not heard him approach, he was Rock Lee writ large, and that was painful for anyone with working fashion sensibilities. She might have been spending more time in blood and mud and less time on her hair, but at no point had she incurred brain damage significant enough to consider a clinging green jumpsuit anything less than spectacularly hideous. Even Sasuke wouldn't have been able to make it look good. Sakura almost couldn't look away, but Kakashi-sensei ignored him. Once the fight below started, Sakura found it an easy thing to replicate, because after a month's separation, with all her bruises and fractures healed and safely a bystander once again, it was hard to remember that she was angry at Sasuke when she was half convinced that at any moment he was going to die. Gaara's match with Dosu had been brutally short, but she'd thought she understood just how dangerous he was. She'd been wrong. As frightening as he'd been when he'd crushed the Otonin, it was worse to see just how ineffective Sasuke's attacks were against him. And when she learned what Kakashi-sensei had meant when he talked about a weapon, she was impressed for all of the roughly 43 seconds it took to understand that Gaara losing his composure wasn't an advantage at all. Things were bad, her breath caught painfully in her throat, chest tight with anxiety, fingers locked on the edge of her seat with such force that there was an ominous groan of protest. And then things got worse. Kill your heroes. Chapter 23. Ichnophobia, Part 2. Her heartbeat slowed, her fingers relaxed, the muscles in her chest unclenched. Sakura slumped back in her seat, subsumed by a warm, drowsy wave. She felt safe and very sleepy. It was that feeling of absolute, cradled in her mother's arms safety that made the world feel wrong. Sakura didn't feel safe even in dreams, there was no reason for it now. Not when she was almost certain she was about to discover if all Sasuke's blood ran as red as the liquid dripping from his knuckles. Genjutsu, she thought, reflexively stopped the flow of chakra in her nervous system. And just like that, the drowsiness vanished, replaced with a tension that had her strung as tight as a koto. She was almost surprised she wasn't vibrating like a plucked string, but she forced herself to let her head loll gracelessly to one side, hands dropping to her lap. Closer to her knives. Sakura's quickly decided her field of vision was too limited, her hair pricling with unease at the thought of pretending to be asleep when she could hear the distinctive sound of kunao striking kunao in the stands around her. Her fingers twisted in a familiar gesture and she slipped out of the shell, her clone remaining slumped in her seat. Crouched on her hands and knees, Sakura took in chaos even down the valley formed by the seats, ninja from the village fighting a war above, around, and between the bodies of civilians and shinobi still caught in the genjutsu. It wasn't until one of their opponents toppled into her space that she caught sight of a too familiar forehead protector. That single musical note told her everything. And nothing. The nothing could wait, because the ninja wasn't dead. Sakura pounced, powerful leg muscles driving the motion smoothly forward, and before the ninja had recovered his balance one of her hands had seized his jaw and she slammed his head against the concrete. Her control over her chakra-enhanced strength had improved over the course of a month when his jaw snapped and splayed and his head impacted with enough force to kill. It was on purpose. She was a long way from shattering boulders and cracking concrete, and she'd fractured her radius in 2 places during that month in practice, but humans were a lot more fragile than rocks. Especially when it involved blunt force trauma to the head. A Jounin, who'd apparently been charging to her rescue or maybe he'd just to finish what he'd started, stared incredulously down at her for a moment and then was gone again without a word. Sakura considered falling back to her original position, but a glance back at Kakashi-sensei and Might Guy revealed 2 Jounin intentionally making targets of themselves and she wanted no part of that action. She thought about sheltering in place, pretending to be dead, and waiting for it all to be over, but that was only that small, frightened self that had never stopped running from that first ninja with quicksilver eyes. The rest of her was calculating how to keep her head down and still contribute to the battle. Better control of her chakra-enhanced strength or not, one-on-one tutoring with her knife skills or not, training in the Shunshin or not, she was one genin. In the stories, Orochimaru was a lot of things, but an idiot wasn't one of them. If she had to invade a foreign village with a limited force, her infiltrators were all going to be Jounin. And against a Jounin, she had exactly one weapon. Surprise. And if that failed, well, they were going to be mailing her to her mother in a box. It was a good thing she had slender shoulders and a child's small body. Otherwise she really wouldn't have been able to squeeze between the feet and seat backs without leaving a telltale trail of shifting bodies. Sakura could swear she could feel her heart thudding against the back wall of her throat as she scurried along between the seats, heading toward a battle that she could hear but couldn't see without raising her head above the safety of her trench. The sheer number of feet she had to skirt made her uneasy. Who was powerful enough to lock down this many ninja in a genjutsu? Was this Orochimaru himself? Some part of her hoped so, because if this wasn't Orochimaru, it meant he had a subordinate capable of this. And that was bad. She tried to shove the thought that the enemy could slaughter the sleeping ninja like cattle under a mental rock, but it was cockroach persistent. Could she wake them? Should she wake them? Or would that just cause more chaos? Sakura reached the battle before she had to come to any decision, and she went to her belly, crawling almost entirely beneath one of the seats and watching the footwork of two jounin as they grappled in the narrow aisle. She was lucky they were talking and the otonin was female, with slender ankles and painted toes. She had to wait for the sneering otonin to come within reach, but when she did, her hand shot forward like a snake striking, and when it closed around the enemy kunoichi's ankle she jerked it toward herself with all her might. The kunoichi had all her weight braced against her opponent, was using chakra to help her keep her footing, but Sakura was the straw that broke the camel's back. The kunoichi went down hard as her opponent capitalized on her sudden weakness and her leg slid beneath the seat where Sakura was lurking. It would have been a bad position to recover from regardless, lunging directly upward likely to dislocate a hip or break her leg, and her opponent wasn't about to give her more space, but Sakura didn't take the chance that one of Orochimaru's people wouldn't bend in places humans couldn't. Modern shinobi were lightly armored as a rule. They were stealth troops, not samurai shock forces, though their ninjutsu made that a possibility. The kunoichi was true to that rule, so it was only fabric and flesh that provided a barrier to her knife. And Sakura kept her knives very sharp. The spout of blood from her femoral artery caught Sakura in the face, startling her, and she smacked her head hard against the underside of the seat. Her backwards scrabble was ungraceful, but she managed to get the blood out of her eyes and wasn't attacked in the interim, so it was a victory. "You okay?" The jounin that she'd just assisted asked her, glancing down at her only briefly before launching a kunao at an opponent. "Provided she doesn't do something stupid like bleed acid," Sakura said, resisting the urge to use her shimik to mop her face. "Sir," she added belatedly. That earned her a harsh chuckle. "You'll be fine. Good assist. Thanks. Good idea or bad idea to try to wake some of our people?" Sakura asked, the feeling of blood on her face overwhelmed by the relief at being able to ask an adult what she should be doing. Even a total stranger. That way, if she woke someone up and they died because of it, it wouldn't be her fault. She was learning to live with the reality of her own mortality and the blood already soaking her hands. She wasn't yet strong enough to bear the deaths of her fellow soldiers, not when it was her decision that brought them there. "If you can bring some of the chunin up, do it," was his response. "Leave the genin under." "Yes, sir," Sakura said. She'd crawled beneath the chunin's seat to get at the Oto kunoichi, now she dragged the chunin down into her trench. She didn't need him standing up in surprise only to catch a kunao to the back of the head. Sakura was less practiced at breaking others out of genjutsu than she was at freeing herself, but seconds later she had a very confused chunin staring up at her. "Wah! We're being invaded by Oto forces," Sakura said curtly. "How good are you at breaking genjutsu?" As it turned out, he wasn't, but he was perfectly willing to drag another chunin to her. Sakura was soon surrounded by enough chunin to form two combat squads, which almost emptied her row of those who'd thought to wear their distinctive flak jackets. There were probably more chunin among them, but they left those in their civvies asleep. One squad covered their advance as they switched rows, a kunoichi wearing Inyazuka clan markings now helping Sakura to break the genjutsu. It was frustratingly slow, because unlike casting a genjutsu, breaking it required physical contact for someone with her skills. And she was getting quickly tired of explaining that yes, there was an invasion and no, she was not going to play 20 questions under fire. It was a very different sort of thing to the fights she'd been in before. This was a battle where killing one or two people almost didn't matter. It wouldn't be over quickly, wouldn't be finished cleanly. They hit patches where the infiltrators had killed their people before a jounin could challenge them, they lost members of their squad as the otonin tried to stop their forward progress. Unlike the jounin, the chunin formed squads to combat the Oto shinobi, 3 teams remaining in orbit around Sakura and the growing complement of genjutsu-capable ninja. I think we've got enough people to break into squads, the Inuzuka Kunoichi working next to Sakura said. 2 to break the genjutsu, 2 combat squads to cover them. Why are you asking me? Some part of Sakura screeched, because the Kunoichi was at least 4 years older than Sakura, but she nodded. The Inuzuka Kunoichi bared her teeth in a fierce smile before she relayed instructions along the line. She took with her a cluster of Abarame Chunin they'd recently woken in a gangly, nervous Chunin who was in his first stage of Medicnin training. Sakura didn't recognize the clan affiliations of any of the Chunin who were suddenly falling in around her, but she thought that her partner in breaking the genjutsu was a Yamanaka. The lead of her combined combat team was a shinobi with long white hair, fine as spider silk, and a Kodaki that flowed like water. Sakura almost head-butted Kakashi-sensei, who was suddenly crouching in front of her as she moved toward her next Chunin. When you're done leading the resistance, Kakashi-sensei said dryly, I have a mission for you. Sakura stared blankly at him for a long moment, her brain readjusting to the idea that there was a world beyond the next Chunin. Then she nodded, glancing up at the lead of her team, who obligingly pulled his blade from the gut of an Oto shinobi and sidled closer. I'm borrowing my student, Kakashi told him before Sakura herself could say anything. Understood, sir, her lead said, and Sakura tried to fix his appearance in her mind. There was a gaping, freely bleeding wound high on his side, which he'd taken when a pair of Suna Kunoichi had tried to rush Sakura. He'd killed the first, taken the wound, killed the second almost before it had sunk in that Suna had betrayed them, was collaborating with Oto for the invasion. She didn't even know his name, and that didn't seem right. When this was over, she'd ask. She rose from her crouch, knees protesting, and then hesitated before following Kakashi. When this was over, there might not be any opportunities for asking. Thank you, she blurted, making him look back at her. I'm Harino Sakura. Sakia. Yomatsu Sakia. I'll let Sasuke know you were having an affair while he was off chasing down Gaara, Kakashi-sensei murmured as he tucked her beneath one arm and flickered to the top level of the stadium, where Naruto crouched and Shikamaru sprawled. Sakura-chan, are you alright? Naruto asked her worriedly, and it took a moment to remember there was blood, dried and flaking, on her face. There'd been other worries. It's not mine, she replied. Did you say Sasuke was chasing Gaara? Sakura asked Kakashi-sensei. His team retrieved him and removed him. And Sasuke decided he'd take the initiative and follow, Kakashi-sensei replied. Which is where you all come in. It'll be the first A-rank mission since Wave. His voice was light, but his single visible eye wasn't laughing. Naruto seemed excited by the prospect of being able to do something, but Sakura's hands tightened into fists. From here, out of the worst of the battle, she could hear the sound of fighting in the streets beyond the stadium. Stupid, some part of her mind said, of course that wasn't all their forces. And there would be others, in the forest. Out there, there wouldn't be a combat squad supporting her, covering her flanks and keeping her from harm. Sakura watched in silence as Kakashi-sensei explained their mission, summoned the Ninken, and sent them on their way. There was almost a sense of inevitability as Pakun alerted them to the fact that they'd picked up a tail. A large group, 8 ninja, 2 Chunin-level combat squads. She listened as Shikamaru condemned himself, volunteered to be the one left behind, to set the ambush so they could go ahead. She could have let him. Not too long ago, she would have let him. He'd have been right, because that Sakura didn't have the necessary skills, but more than that, that Sakura wouldn't have had the requisite courage. She was not that Sakura. She took some small comfort in the fact that Kakashi-sensei seemed to have anticipated this, sending the whole pack and not just Pakun. No, she said firmly, earning her a surprised glance. Your chakra reserves haven't recovered from your match with Temari. You're more clever than I am, Shikamaru, but you can't outwit chakra exhaustion. Take Pakun with you and catch up to Sasuke, before he gets himself hurt. The pack and I will take care of it. Someone she didn't look down to discover who, but the fur felt like Shiba or maybe Akino brushed beneath her hand in a gesture of silent comfort. Are you sure? Naruto blurted. Yes. The word wasn't as firm as she wanted, so she cleared her throat and tried again. Yes. It's not fine, but none of this is, she said, jerking her chin back toward where smoke was blackening the sky above the village. Just, get Sasuke. Please. If she explained any further, tried to say anything more, she was going to lose her nerve. She clenched her teeth tight to prevent any more words from escaping. She expected Naruto to argue, but he was giving her a very strange look. And then he nodded solemnly. Okay, he said, voice raspy. Okay. We'll be back to pick you up before you know it. And then we'll give what for together. And then they were gone. Kill your heroes. Chapter 24. Ichnophobia, Part 3. Sakura made a silent resolution to herself that when she survived this battle, she was going to acquire a sealing scroll, fill it with everything she thought she'd need and some she didn't, and carry it everywhere. She'd even take into the bath and tuck it under her pillow at night, if that was what it took to have it with her when it would be really useful. Like now. She had her basic kit, because that already followed her around more faithfully than one of the Ninken when there were treats to be had, but as she crouched down in a strategy circle with the Ninken, she couldn't help but feel that more equipment would be more useful than a head full of mostly theoretical knowledge. Luckily, the Ninken brought a lot of experience to the table. For a brief moment, she'd felt very alone when Naruto and Shikamaru had left, but that had been wrong. She did have teammates, packmates, 7 of them, the numbers not so unbalanced as she'd feared. We can't risk trying a genjutsu trap, not with a squad this large, Akino murmured. Guriko nodded gravely. Unless you can take them all out quickly and cleanly, it'll turn into a trap for you instead of for them. And for us. We're going to have to separate them. Hunt, harry, herd, Baisuke recited solemnly. We've never practiced this, never hunted as a pack with you, Sakura, so listen. Hey, Akino and Shiba are the fastest of the pack and working together, they can run your average ninja into the ground. They'll hamstring a shinobi and take them down working together, but only Bull is big enough to pull down a man on his own. He's got twice the crush power in his jaws as the rest of us. He can break the big bones in a man's leg. Bull gave a huff of agreement. Guriko, Uroshi, and I are primarily trackers, but we can distract and harry an enemy. Sakura nodded, committing everything to memory. She was familiar with the speed of each of the dogs, had seen several of their tactics in use, but it would be different when it wasn't in play. Sakura could remember clearly that first, terrifying run in Wave, so she saw the advantage of using the pack. They just had to think of a plan that used all their strengths effectively. It didn't have to be foolproof. Naruto wasn't here, but it did have to work. Sakura closed her eyes, biting her lip. 8 ninja. 2 combat teams. It probably wouldn't be hard to separate them into 2 teams. Habit was a powerful force and very few ninja had much practice on working with a squad larger than 4. If it was a small enough threat, they'd likely split into 2 cells, one to deal with it and the other to continue to their assigned target. If she was very lucky, they would only send 1 or 2 ninja to investigate the split in their tracks, but Naruto was the one with the favor of the cosmos. Sakura would plan for a full team. Whatever her plan was beyond that, it couldn't be time intensive. She'd still need to catch up to the squad pursuing the others before they actually caught them. There were certain distress signals that were pretty universal that might make them turn back, but she couldn't risk that more of the Oto or Suna forces would come investigate. I must be like lightning, Sakura thought to herself. So fast, so sudden, it's gone before the sound arrives. She hadn't meant it as a pun, but as the thought anchored itself in her resolve, she realized the play on words. When they talk about turning out like your sensei, she thought wryly, crossed her arms across the top of her knees and ducking her head behind the barrier, I thought I'd end up with something more useful than Kakashi-sensei's terrible sense of humor. Kill your heroes. Sakura lay belly down in a tangled patch of briars, in a sort of tunnel created by animal traffic. It wasn't ideal cover, but this deep beneath the iconic, towering trees of Konoha's home forests, briars and their like were the only things with the tenacity to grow. Her shimok was tied securely over the lower half of her face, the fabric taut against her cheekbones. She'd retrieved her combat glasses from her pouch the first time she'd poked herself in the eye with a low-hanging branch when moving faster than the human eye could normally track was the last time, so far as she was concerned. She'd been more than half convinced she'd put her eye out. Sleek, sort of cool-looking, Her combat glasses sat close to her face and had a narrow rim of some spongy material around the lens edges that she could channel chakra into to create a seal, which she'd done. Sakura wished for the reassuring warmth of a small body tucked at her side, but for now the Ninken were outside the clearing, per the plan. Pakun was the best sensor of the pack, but Akino had confirmed that a full squad had taken their bait and followed Sakura's trail. Her fingers dug furrows in the loam as she watched them walk into the clearing, their steps heavy with confidence. 4 men, older, with no distinctive uniforms or weaponry. Chunin rather than Jounin. Which makes them still better than Yunin, she reminded herself harshly. She held her breath as one ninja almost stepped on her fingers, but her genjutsu was apparently proof against their detection. That was good. They'd been almost certain the team had been tracking them conventionally. A good sensor type would have made her genjutsu as pointless as a paper bag pulled over her head at this range. Sakura didn't shift, even when the ninja pivoted to say something to his team. A shinobi chooses his moment, she told herself, but the waiting was terrible. She was utterly convinced that the sound of her heartbeat was just as loud to the enemy as it was to her, that the Otonin were toying with her, but then one of the ninja placed his foot squarely on one of the tagged packets. The directed pulse of chakra interrupted her genjutsu, but the tags concealed around the clearing went up with a roar, heavy gray smoke billowing outward, and contained in that smoke was enough airborne capsaicin to make Sakura's throat burn instantly despite her precautions. It was much worse for the Otonin, but there was no guilt or pity for them, not like that silver-eyed nin who died in fire. This was her home, the last safe place. And they'd ruined it. She didn't even have to lunge for the ninja, he'd been that close, just raise up on her knees, knives driving forward into his femoral artery. Not lower in his thigh, as it passed through the adductor hiatus, like the kunoichi, but just below his groin. Her knives were turned with the curve down and angled slightly, like razor-backed fish, slicing through the heavy muscle to open the medial circumflex femoral artery. He collapsed almost on top of her and Sakura had to twist awkwardly away to avoid being trapped by his weight and the natural snare of the briars. She hissed in a breath as a kunai drew a long, shallow gash along her collarbons and that deep breath burned worse than the wound, but she swallowed down the urge to cough, turning the pain and the fear into movement. Thanks to Kakashi-sensei and the Ninken, she had plenty of experience in maneuvering in heavy briar growth, which was all thorny snares and unexpectedly strong plants. Wherever sound was, they apparently had less undergrowth. Charging forward in these conditions required stepping high and clear, not like the low, soft steps that ninja were trained to use to minimize noise. Even in the heavy smoke, she could track her opponents by the sound of the cursing, coughing, and tugging on the network of briars. She heard it grow quieter on her left, one of them taking to the trees, but that left 2 of them on the ground. Her covering smoke was a double-edged blade. It made it much harder to dodge kunai. 2 more dug trails on her arms as she swept toward the target farthest to her right. She didn't know how he saw her through the tears streaming from his eyes, but he had a pair of kunai in his hands. He was taller, stronger, but the capsaicin was doing its work, his breathing rasping, uneven, interrupted by violent coughing. It's hard to fight when you can't breathe. His strikes were rough, a little desperate, and nowhere near as fast as Reita-sensei's. He struck at her with both kunai pressed close together, driving them toward the center of her mass, which might have been more effective with his full strength and some momentum behind it. She used her left-hand knife to redirect the force of the blow to one side, giving her an opening. Sakura heard another of the Otonin coming up behind her and panicked a little, lunging forward even though the angle wasn't right. Her strike along his side wasn't clean, and one of his hands came back and caught her in the jaw, the cold metal ring of his kunai leading the blow. Sakura lost her footing, the metal slamming into her cheek hard enough to make her teeth break through the skin, and the teeth themselves felt painful and loose, but she wasn't given any time to recover. This close, the smoke made a less than effective barrier and her opponents were trying to end this as quickly as she was. She shoved chakra forcefully into the solace of her feet, running forward when her cowardly self screamed run away. One knife was sheathed, her hand pitching kunai with chakra driving them whistling through the air, and there was her opening again. Her recovery was unexpectedly quick, judging by the widening of his eyes, and she came low, her shoulder catching the injured nin just below his ribcage only seconds before the knife in her other hand went deep. Too deep. She felt the tug as he began to fall, knew that she ran the risk of breaking the blade if she'd caught it between vertebrae. She let the knife go, just in time to badly block another strike from his partner and barely twist aside when the other Otonin dropped down from the trees. Mostly twist aside. There was a burning line straight down on shoulder blade, but it wasn't her spine and it hurt less than her face. And it didn't interfere with her ability to strategically retreat, the smoke having dissipated enough that she could clearly see her opponents again. She used the trees to make it difficult for them to use Kunao, and they hadn't come more than 20 yards before the Ninken made themselves known. Uroshi bolted from the underbrush, acting like a living tripwire, the Otonin's momentum sending him face first to the ground. Before he could do more than come up on his elbows, Bull was on him, powerful jaws closing over the back of his neck. Sakura turned just in time to see Uhei, Akino, and Shiba burst from their own hiding places, two of them flanking the last ninja and catching his sleeves in snapping teeth, the third savaging the back of one knee. He began struggling wildly, but Akino and Shiba kept their grip and pulled at his arms like a macabre tug-of-war. Sakura heard the fabric of his sleeves begin to give, but her kunao had already caught him in the base of his throat. Breathing heavily, Sakura very carefully raised a hand to her neck. When she'd twisted, there'd been a sharp jolt of pain and then numbness. Vertebrae out of alignment. Nothing she could do about it, except hope nothing caught when she tried to turn her head. She didn't even try to investigate her cheek. The Ninken didn't wait on her when she doubled back to retrieve her second knife. They would need the time to get as close to the other squad as possible, because while they were fast, none of the Ninken could move at Shunshin speeds without Kakashi-sensei's assistance. Sakura had to work to bring her breathing under control, because this would not only be the most dangerous Shunshin she'd ever done, it would also be the longest. And the others had been under supervision, in very controlled conditions. Mistakes made at that speed meant shattered bones or worse. Even if she didn't hit anything, if she screwed up the chakra flow that would temporarily increase the speed at which her optical nerve processed input, she could potentially be blind for the rest of her life. Shunshin made for a strange experience, seeming to expand time and compress distance, but there had been a sharp thrill in mastering it. She just hadn't expected to be quizzed on that mastery so soon. She took another breath, stilled her quivering. And then she moved. The Chunin had half turned toward her, so her knife ripped cleanly through his throat, blood slinging in a liquid arc from the edge of her knife. Shit, one of her opponents snarled violently as the rest of the team whirled to face her. Looks like Akaga's squad dropped the ball, another commented, sounding far less worried than his companion. That worried Sakura, but she was already doubling back on her own trail, racing toward the Ninken. They'd hoped the ninja would choose to chase the prey they could see, and Sakura felt a brief flare of satisfaction as she caught glimpses of all three when she dared glance back. That satisfaction turned to pain as three ninja proved too much for her skill at dodging. She had to leap to clear a deadfall and a kunao caught her high in the shoulder. She made a strange, half-stifled scream and landed heavily, but she kept running. She was getting worried and a little lightheaded by the time she heard the Ninken set upon the Otonin, and she turned just in time to catch the full force of a running tackle. The impact drove the kunao set in her shoulder even deeper, and this time she did scream, but she also clawed one-handedly at her attacker's eyes and bucked hard enough to throw him off. Sakura scrabbled upright and found herself almost face-to-face with that nin who'd spoken with such confidence earlier. He was wearing an unnerving grin as he rose from the forest floor, casually brushing off the legs of his pants. Was there some sort of requirement in Oto's shinobi code that said they weren't allowed to let ninja out of training until they'd convinced them that a kill wasn't any good unless they spiced it with a little fear? She felt nauseous from the pain and her left arm wasn't working well, though a rough movement as the Otonin proved it wasn't only Konoha that knew how to use fire dislodged the kunao. Guriko almost startled her as he charged in, but their opponent was fast on his feet and he caught the small dog hard in the ribs. Guriko yelped as the force lifted him off his feet and slammed him heavily into a tree. A handful of senbon pinned him there and Sakura darted in, trying to make use of the opening, but she underestimated just how good her opponent was. The broad, wedged-shaped blade of the kunao caught between her ribs and she screamed again, but she managed to catch his wrist before he could pull his weapon free. The scream turned into a warcry and she head-butted him with everything she had left, put all the force in her body into the blow, and she heard the sickening crack of his nose giving way. She let go of his wrist to grab at his collar and smash her head more squarely into his forehead, and when his dead weight pulled at her arms, she let him drop. Sakura stood still for a long moment, her vision unfocused and her eyes dripping freely, gasping in air. Then she clawed at her shimok, yanking it down just in time to throw up everything in her stomach. When she was finished, she found herself on her hands and knees, almost sobbing as she used the fabric to clean away the vomit that had leaked through the long, ragged hole in her cheek. Her hands went to the kunai lodged between her ribs, but someone barked at her, "Don't pull it out. It hurts, it hurts, it hurts." She keened and struggled upright, stuffing the soiled shimok roughly into a pouch. She tried to stop her tears, because her ragged breathing made every wound echo pain back at her, but it was beyond her. All she could do was stagger over to Guriko, pulling out the senbon as gently as her clumsy fingers were able. He was breathing, but he lay in a little crumpled heap that she gathered carefully to her chest. The other ninkin gathered around her, the fur on their muzzles stiff with drying blood. Even as she watched, Bull sniffed her downed opponent and then closed his teeth over the shinobi's throat. He gave the body a savage shake before he released him and padded up to her, whining faintly in the back of his throat. "This is as far as we go," Sakura said softly. "This is where our mission ends. Kill your heroes." Chapter 25. Asthenophobia. It took Sakura a long time to realize she was losing short patches of time. Or maybe it was only a short time to realize in a long time she was losing. When she tried to look up at the sun to gauge the passage of time, a hot wave of not quite pain radiated out from her neck and she found she couldn't tilt her head back any further. That was okay, she decided, feeling Bull's head pressing against her back in an effort to keep her upright. If she didn't remember stopping, found herself staring blankly ahead with the ninkin whining encouragement at her knees, that was okay. Even the pain, which seemed to get worse with every step, was okay. These things were evidence of survival. Only she was allowed to decide when it was time to lay down and die. And that was going to be a long, long time from now in a soft, super fluffy bed. It would be warm and comfortable and it would be just like falling asleep at the end of a long day. A good day, where she'd done something that didn't involve dead men and the memories they'd carved into her. Someone would be there, she decided as she made a conscious decision to take one more step. Everyone died alone, but she could have someone at her side until that last moment, and when she'd gone on, he'd follow. He wouldn't leave her, even for death she'd go first, she decided, and took another step. She tried to picture Sasuke laying at her side, fingers interlaced with hers, breath slowing in time with hers, but found she couldn't picture an old Sasuke at all. As she stumbled and nearly fell on top of Guriko's limp weight, she realized she couldn't picture herself old either. Her long, long time from now seemed like someone else's dream. But she clung to it tenaciously. Maybe she couldn't imagine it properly, but that didn't matter. She was going to live long enough to see it. "We're almost to Konoha," someone said encouragingly. She had to blink several times to get her eyes to focus on the ninkin speaking to her. Baisuke, she thought, inordinately pleased with herself after the effort it took to retrieve his name. "Come on, Sakura, you've got this beat," Shiba said, prancing from side to side in a way that made her feel like she was going to throw up again. Sakura blinked at Shiba and Baisuke, then realized she was missing dogs. Several of them. Where did everyone? "They've gone to find someone to help," Baisuke said. Sakura nodded dumbly, but she kept walking because she'd driven it into herself that walking was good, was synonymous with not dead, and she was still not dead. So she walked straight into a barrier that gave, just a little, but it was enough to stop all her forward momentum and she sunk down on her heels, still clutching at Guriko. Forcing her numb fingers to release his fur, she patted down her leg until her hand closed over her knife. "Whoa, hold up there," someone said. "I happened to see Kakashi's ninkin running through the street like there was an even bigger fire somewhere else, and when I ask them what's the matter, they tell me one of his students is injured. And here I come to find that not only is his student a cute little miss, she's entirely prepared to stab me. That sort of breaks my heart." Sakura glanced up as far as she could before the pain stopped her, then rolled her eyes up, trying to take in something. Her first, overwhelming impression was hair. Lots of hair, rough and white, like. Her mind failed her as she tried to think up a suitable metaphor, but then all that hair shifted as the man crouched down. She was immediately struck with the impression that she knew this man, but didn't know him. "You're Orochimaru's teammate," she said when she failed to remember his name. His head sagged, and when he looked up again, his smile was slightly rueful. You know, it's been years since I've been sidelined as Orochimaru's teammate, but sure. My name is Jiraiya, and let's just cut off introductions there for now, before you do something very dramatic like die in my arms. Good fiction, bad reality. And without a single indication of effort, he picked them both up. Sakura's stomach lurched, but it seemed like a tremendous effort to throw up, so she kept up her interior litany of just another minute, you can get through it, it will get better. She and Guriko were quickly handed over to some sort of field clinic, where the medic Nin made a lot of noise and Jiraiya promptly disappeared. And the sight of his long, spiky hair past his hips swaying with his stride was the last thing Sakura remembered as the medic Nin put her under. Kill your heroes. Judging by Asuma's thunderous expression, he'd found his student. Kakashi briefly considered putting on his best, giving a damn, expression, but he didn't, and there were bodies burning in the streets, so he didn't. What were you thinking? The other man demanded. Sending Genin after a monster like Gaara. Sorry, Kakashi said with mock pleasantry, I must have overlooked all the Jounin with nothing to do in the middle of a joint invasion. Asuma didn't back down. You send Genin to get civilians into the emergency shelters, you don't send them hunting Jinchuriki. Well, Kakashi drawled, Suna did forget to send a note about that one. Maybe you should take it up with the Kaze cage. I'm serious, Kakashi. They could have been killed. Kakashi's brows swept toward his hairline and masterfully didn't gesture back to the arena, where there were dead Genin enough to make the point that there wasn't any guaranteed safety in times like these. Were they? He asked instead. Not the ones I brought back with me, Asuma admitted after a grudging pause. Shikamaru is suffering from nothing worse than chakra exhaustion. And both your students will recover. Both? I have 3. The third is just proof of what I've been saying. When Shikamaru told me that your Kunoichi had stayed back to meet an ambush of no less than 8 Chunin with just your dogs as support, I left him and your 2 to limp back to Konoha while I doubled back on their trail. And? Kakashi prompted. And she must have gotten lucky, one of ours must have interfered. There's a trail of dead Chunin and a blood trail that a blind man could follow that dead ends outside Konoha's walls. You'd just better hope that your dogs were enough to make sure it was a Konoha shinobi that took her. Kakashi frowned, because while he'd acknowledged that sending them out was a risk, Konoha's military strength was nothing to be scoffed at. There'd been enough Jounin and Chunin to occupy the invasion forces. Time 4 Genin shouldn't have drawn the attention of 2 squads, not outside the walls when the real fight was inside them. For all that Naruto was what he was also soundly sealed, and Sasuke's Sharingan hadn't evolved to the point where it was indelibly burned into his chakra signature. If they'd been chasing fleeing Genin just for the fun of it, it was sloppy and undisciplined. He crossed his hands behind his back to disguise the clenching of his fists, but his loss of control was only momentary. He smiled, eye creasing with the force of the motion. My guess is that no one interfered, he told Asuma as he bit down on his thumb hard enough to draw blood. A pulse of chakra, his reserves were low enough that it gave him a faint headache, but the Sharingan was an insatiable pit he'd learned to live with. Head at his feet, muzzle stained with blood. Kakashi, the hound said, relief heavy in his voice. Sakura, she? Oh, you're about to get the news, a familiar voice said as the Toad Sage dropped without warning from a nearby roof. There'd been enough Jounin in the arena that Kakashi and Guy had moved onto the streets, helping to reduce civilian casualties by the simplest expedient, killing all the invaders before they could kill anyone else. Guy had, of course, tried to make it a competition, slightly more serious than their usual ones. Kakashi wasn't that crass, but he was winning. He cocked a brow at Jiraiya, who said, someone really did a number on your Kunoichi, Kakashi. I'm impressed she managed to escape and make it as far as she did. For such a cute little miss, she's got some real grit. Kakashi glanced back down at Uehei. What happened? Asuma tells me you fell back to lay an ambush. Uehei perked his ears and ducked his head. Yes. 2 combat squads. We brought them all down before they could reach the others, but the last one got Guriko and Sakura. She brought him down, though, and Bull finished him, he said, baring his teeth in a fierce canine smile. 3 of the kills were hers outright, and she finished off another while he was in our teeth, and she could have killed the last one. The medic nin say she'll probably recover without complications, but it was very close. Kakashi. Kakashi's eyes strayed over to Asuma, who was staring slack-jawed at the hound, his cigarette threatening to escape his lips. I told you I didn't think anyone interfered, he said evenly to the other jounin. Wa Kakashi, Asuma trailed off, shaking his head. Then he sighed, sucked in a noisy breath, and said, I have to go check on the rest of my students, before bounding off. Jiraiya was staring thoughtfully at the hound, brows deeply furrowed, but his expression relaxed when he caught Kakashi's glance. For such a cute little miss, sounds like you're raising her pretty hard, Kakashi. Kakashi chuckled, a flat, humorless sound. At this rate, it's less like I'm raising her and more like she's surviving me. I put her in a position where she killed on her first mission outside the village, and then she went and managed to impress Orochimaru during her Chunin exam. Jiraiya's gaze sharpened. She did identify me as Orochimaru's teammate. Did he try to recruit her? Oddly enough, he told me she was too dangerous to keep. Of course, that was right after she'd lost her preliminary round. Losing usually doesn't impress Orochimaru, Jiraiya pointed out, curiosity heavy in his tone. It does when your opponent almost dies 20 minutes later because you've got poison smeared on your blades. And she'd almost killed his entire genin team, and she survived an encounter with him personally in the Forest of Death. Just a few days earlier Sakura made quite an impression. He was hunting the Sharingan, though. I didn't think he'd turn it into a full-scale invasion, he said darkly. Jiraiya chuckled, low and bitter. I don't know that anyone knows what goes through that head of his anymore. Then he shrugged, almost like he was throwing off an invisible weight. Well, lots of fires to put out, damsels in distress to rescue. And just like that, the Toad Sage was gone. Kill your heroes. Sakura woke up in time for the third's funeral, the hole in her cheek reduced to a long, shiny scar. She touched it gingerly as she examined her reflection, suddenly nostalgic for the cleaner line of her knife scar. This one was wider, a little ragged looking, but they'd regenerated enough flesh before sealing it that it wasn't puckered or twisted looking. It had, of course, bruised spectacularly, but the swelling was almost gone and it wasn't to the sickly yellow stage yet. The medic nin had put most of their effort and chakra into healing the much more dangerous stab wound, which was still very tender, though they'd apparently found enough time to put her spine back into alignment. More shallow cuts they'd left to heal on their own time. Kakashi-sensei had been by this morning to help her change the dressing on the long cut down her shoulder blade, which had taken 4 stitches. Sakura pulled her fingers away from the scar, returning to the reason she was in front of a mirror at all. It was a miserably overcast day, which leaned the right sort of melancholy for the funeral of a man as great as the third, but she also wanted to be her neat, presentable best when they paid their respects. Her hair, unfortunately, took on a life of its own in humidity, so it was less a matter of styling it and more a matter of taming it. By the time she'd managed something respectable, though no amount of product had stopped her hair from parting itself back into rough spikes, it was time to rendezvous with the rest of Team 7. She idled a few extra seconds in front of the mirror, tugging at her clothing, though she'd ironed it very carefully that morning and already done a thorough Ninken hair inspection. Even her knife rig had been carefully cleaned, so that it no longer smelled like old battles. When she couldn't delay any more without actually risking being late, she left her house. She kept her eyes mostly on her feet, because she didn't want to see the damage that had been done to the village or all the signs of mourning. Sakura hadn't heard anyone come out with any official numbers, but the simple fact that they wouldn't release any casualty reports meant it was bad. Like, significantly weaken their military strength and lose clients to other villages and invite other attacks kind of bad. But she tried to shove that aside. Today wasn't supposed to be a day about numbers, profits, and losses, it was supposed to be able the people those numbers hid. She would do her utmost to respect that. Neither Sasuke or Naruto said a word to her, though Naruto did give her a limp sort of wave and such a pathetic smile that she wanted to pat him on the head like he was one of the Ninken. Sasuke's eyes lingered on the vivid scar across her cheek like he wanted to say something, but he turned away instead and led them to where the service was being held. It started raining in the middle of it, like the village itself was crying, and she thinks that it was perfect and fitting, though she's also pulped the stem of flower she's meant to lay on the coffin in an effort to keep her own tears at bay. When the official ceremony was over, people started to break into tight knots, talking in low voices. Sasuke and Naruto both disappeared, but Sakura didn't try to find them. She was surprised when a friendly hand clamped down on her shoulder and she looked up to find a solemn Inyazuka Kunoichi. It was the same girl who'd been helping her during the invasion. "Hey," she said, in that pleasant, slightly husky voice that seemed to be a common trait of her family. "I don't think we ever had time to properly introduce ourselves." A huge dog plopped itself down inches from Sakura's feet, wagging its tail slightly. He or she wasn't like Akamaru, was instead like one of the huge wolf dogs she's seen other members of Kiba's clan with, this one ruddy-colored. "Hara no Sakura," Sakura offered somewhat timidly. "Inyazuka Mariko. And this is Ri," she said, tilting her head down at the dog. "Thanks, the dog," she said. "For helping Mariko out." She bared her teeth, but it was a silent gesture. Stupid, to ban the ninja from bringing their companions if they're full-grown. Apparently we make the diplomats nervous. As if we're all that eager to bite them. If you can get past the stench of their cologne, you can taste it. Mariko grinned down at her companion, then sobered quickly. "When it was all over, we decided we'd find you and thank you. Good manners and all that, since you probably saved our lives. Good thing your hair stands out, though you could stand to grow a couple feet. I didn't realize you were so young." "We?" Sakura asked, but Mariko was already motioning to others. Familiar faces, ones she recognized from the stands. Sakia was there too, which was a relief, and he and the others formed up around her in their own little cluster of conversation. From the corner of her eye, she glimpsed Team 10, but then someone said something and her attention was drawn back to the Chunin who'd stood with her during the invasion. They were strangers, some of whose names she would doubtless forget, some of whom she might never speak to again, but for now they were companions, united by experience and grief. Kill your heroes. Chapter 26. Hypnophobia. Sakura didn't see much of either of her teammates in the following days, though she saw enough of the Ninken and Kakashi-sensei. It was only her very early morning practices that continued as they had for now. There wasn't enough leisure time to casually hold squad practice. She could only assume that Sasuke and Naruto were still doing their own morning solo practices as well, because she, the other genin, and most of the Chunin had been tapped as labor and had been separated into work teams supervised by civilians. Beginning the day after the third's funeral, for an entire week, Konoha turned every available resource toward rebuilding, including its human resources. No battle was ever fought that cleaned up after itself. The large summons that had been present in some of the more impressive ninjutsu had destroyed a lot of infrastructure. Almost 40% of the village was without power and 20% was without running water. Hundreds had emerged from the shelters to find their homes destroyed and their shops ruined. It was to those shops and homes that the younger ninja were assigned. It was the jounin who were dealing with the bodies, dredging them out of the rivers so they couldn't contaminate their drinking water, doing mass burning of the otonin before insects and vermin turned them into vectors of disease. It was, in short, a disaster. And in order to fund the recovery, jounin and chunin were going to be dispatched in large numbers once they returned from escorting the shaken dignitaries home. Most of those had stayed long enough for the third's funeral, both out of respect and because they'd been made to understand that until the ninja had secured the village and had time to assess that they weren't going to meet any nasty surprises on the way home, it would be far safer to stay a few nights in the village. Sakura had heard most of this from Kakashi-sensei, when he had informed her that she'd be working under a construction foreman after another team had cleared an area of rubble and salvaged what they could. The combination of her chakra-enhanced strength, excellent grounding in practical mathematics, and her ability to walk up vertical surfaces guaranteed her a career in the construction industry if she ever got tired of the kunoichi life, Kakashi-sensei had told her dryly before making himself scarce. She had no idea what Naruto or Sasuke had been roped into doing, but somehow she was pretty certain that Kakashi-sensei was avoiding anything that even looked like heavy labor. As for her, though she was mostly fetching and holding and carrying for real carpenters, it was considered more skilled than carting rubble. Which meant that most of her crew was older, some of them even chunin. They'd intimidated her the first day she'd reported to the address that Kakashi-sensei had given her, but except for one or two of them who couldn't seem to pass her without heckling her, they were all nice enough. Sakura fell into a kind of routine, one helped by the fact that she wasn't sleeping well at night again, which meant she was bone-tired by the time she dragged herself home in the evening. She cleaned her knives, inventoried her kit, scrubbed at stains that would never come out of her shimmick. Eventually, she'd fall asleep usually after she'd given in and moved to a room that didn't have a window that opened onto a balcony. She sort of liked the shower. There weren't any windows in the room, and with enough pillows, the guest futon, and a blanket shoved inside the room, it felt a little like one of the nest forts her father had helped her build as a child. After rigging the door, it was very cozy indeed. She knew it was not necessarily healthy, but it was what it was and it was her routine. Until the morning the Ninken didn't come. Bemused, Sakura stowed away the guest futon and refolded her blanket very neatly. By the time she'd dressed and the pack hadn't appeared, she was worried, but also half convinced that Kakashi-sensei had left on a mission without telling her and taken the Ninken with him. When she'd finished eating breakfast, she'd reconsidered that, because as much as she liked to harp about how irresponsible and irritating Kakashi-sensei was, he'd never left her without the Ninken in the morning before. Not since Wave. Sakura was probably the only one of her team who knew their sensei's address, though it had been Pakun and not Kakashi who had given it to her. She'd never used it before now, but urgency and worry were their own excuses. Sakura eventually made it to his apartment building, though she'd taken at least 2 wrong turns and resorted to asking directions from an old man setting up a takoyaki stand. Sakura lived in a neighborhood of nice single-family homes, where entrepreneurial types ran things like bakeries and flower shops on the ground floor. Pakun had told her that they and Kakashi-sensei lived in an apartment building. She just hadn't expected quite what she found. Clean, well-maintained, but clearly showing its age, its units very small if she judged by the space between doors. The whole neighborhood was like that, clean but run down, the streets more narrow than she was accustomed to. Of course, now that she'd seen it, she couldn't have said what she'd been expecting. As far as she'd observed, all Kakashi-sensei really needed was a dry space to store his smutty books. He hadn't even bothered to personalize his uniform, and she'd never seen him use anything other than standard ninja kit. If it weren't for the Ninken, she could almost have believed that he bunked with a different woman every night like that one rumor said. Or, more likely, took up space on unsuspecting people's couches. Maybe had long-suffering friends with guest bedrooms. Sakura was staring up at the balconies, trying to make sense of the numbering system, when she heard a door open and shut somewhere on the 4th floor. She automatically looked in the direction of the noise, but she was surprised to recognize the person pacing agitatedly back and forth on the balcony. Genma-sensei. She called up to him. She was still working on her lip reading, but the shape of an expletive was easy to make out. Genma-sensei swung himself easily over the railing, landing enviably lightly on his feet. "What's wrong with Kakashi-sensei?" Sakura demanded. Genma-sensei scrubbed a hand through his hair. "All of his students have fantastic timing," he grumbled, then sighed deeply. Kakashi was involved in an incident. A classified incident, he clarified when Sakura opened her mouth to ask for details. "He's injured and out of commission for a little while, that's all. They're waiting on a specialist," he said after a significant pause. "Oh," was Sakura's soft, startled exclamation, because she'd only ever seen Kakashi-sensei exhausted, never really injured, even against Zabuza. "But he'll be all right?" she asked hopefully. "We'll see," was Genma-sensei's less than encouraging reply. "But it might be a while, Sakura." "Damn it," he said with feeling. "You're going to be finished with the work group in a couple days. And I've already received a list of assignments thick enough to choke on. But I'll try to work something out at the very least, pull you down some D ranks or something. Give me until the day after tomorrow, all right?" Sakura could only nod silently, then she glanced up at Kakashi's apartment. "Can I go see him?" she asked quietly. Genma-sensei's hand came down on her head and, rather than ruffle her hair, simply rocked it back and forth. "Sure, princess," he said gently. "I'll even let you take care of Kakashi's dusting. Kill your heroes." Genma-sensei was as good as his word, though his words as he led her to the site of her next assignment were something less than encouraging. "Just be respectful," he said quietly, his hand on her shoulder. Sakura glanced up at him, then at the house they'd been approaching. It looked picturesque, a tidy little house shadowed by low, fruiting trees. It was outside the walls, far from urban center of Konoha and one of the small communities that had developed as the population overflowed the bounds of the original village. The only sounds were the rustle of grass, the song of birds, and the hum of bees. She darted another glance back up at him. "It's usually Chunin who come out here to run errands," he said, still in a low voice. "You can think of this as a kind of retirement community." "Running errands is usually kind of a genin thing," Sakura observed, her own voice almost a whisper. "Yeah, well," Genma said, staring at the porch and its single rocking chair, "they called her grandmother Nightmare." And that was the phrase echoing in her head as she tentatively rapped on the door. "Ma'am," she called, "I'm Harano Sakura. I'm the genin that was sent to work for you this morning." Sakura heard the sound of very soft footsteps only just before the door opened. With an introduction like, "Obazan no Akumu," she'd braced herself for all sorts of things. What she got was a woman who stood no taller than she did, who smelled faintly of talcum powder and lavender, and whose smile lines were etched deep. As the woman's eyes brushed over the new scar on her face, Sakura resisted the urge to duck her head. Of course people looked. If it was someone else's face, she'd do the same. It was only when they stared that her cheeks started to burn and she was torn between anger at them and anger at herself. It was nothing to be ashamed of. One day, she'd have repeated it to herself until she believed in it like she'd once believed that following the rules would keep her safe. Today wasn't that day, but then the woman looked away. Sakura scrambled in her memory for her real name, because she couldn't think of a quicker way to make a bad first impression than calling her grandmother Nightmare to her face. It came easily enough, because she'd asked Genma-sensei about it. Her name was Gozen Reiji, and though Reiji was a common enough name, it was also generally a man's name. Genma-sensei had just glanced down at her and given her an enigmatic smile, senbon flicking. It's a pleasure to meet you, Gozen-san," Sakura said, ducking her head. The woman's brows rose faintly, but she smiled. "We have a busy day ahead of us," she said. "Harano-chan, wasn't it?" Maybe it was because Kakashi-sensei had been her taskmaster, but as the morning slid by, she only found Gozen-san demanding rather than nightmarish. She asked things to be done in just the way she wanted them, quickly and without mistakes. And she rewarded success with more complicated instructions, some of which she briefly suspected Gozen-san of making less than clear on purpose. And stopped suspecting almost immediately, because she knew it was probably just prejudice based on that nickname. That was before she kept catching sight of things, creeping things, crawling things in her peripheral vision. Before she helped replant flowers and more things crept over her fingers than by rights should be in any square foot of soil, especially as there was nothing there when she jerked her hands back. Before shadows in the towels she was folding kept growing legs and flexing mandibles. She suspected genjutsu, but even when she subtly interrupted her chakra flow, she couldn't sense the moment when it broke. Or the moment when she was caught in another one. But she kept her mouth shut, did what Gozen-san asked, and showed up promptly at the appointed time the next day. Sakura wanted less and less to go, but she kept at it, for 4 long days so full of subtle genjutsu that even when she'd left the house and stopped the chakra flow that would dismiss a lingering illusion, shadows still kept creeping at her in her own home. She'd stopped trying to sleep in her bed entirely and she'd tried leaving the lights on when she went to sleep, but found that only cast darker shadows. So she stayed in the dark, told herself that she would not be beaten by an old woman, and took frigid showers to wash away the sticky, clinging sensation of exhausted nightmares. But on day 5, when the shadows started creeping, she didn't have to form any hand sign at all. It was sort of like consciously blinking, if you happened to have hundreds of eyes. She blinked a lot that morning, the genjutsu growing more obvious and aggressive as her day marched toward lunch. And when her onigiri turned into a handful of maggots, she didn't even bother to dispel the illusion. It still tasted delicious. That earned her a slightly different smile, one with sharper edges. Gozen-san pulled her elbows onto the table, supporting her chin with her hands. "You're a genjutsu type," she observed. "Yes, ma'am," Sakura answered, uncertain as to where the old women intended to lead the conversation. "They send them to me occasionally." "Want me to teach them?" she confided. Or that's what they call it. I call it theft. Her eyes were very hard, a strange hazel with a starburst core of green, as she met Sakura's gaze. In my day, they did not welcome kunoichi. Women were wives and mothers, and if they fought, it was an extension of that role. To protect their house, their children. Even that was frowned upon. Even now, you hear constantly about the great, and there was a right twist to that word, shinobi of the past. Their triumphs, their wars. How many kunoichi do you hear about in the academy? There's Tsunade-sama, ma'am, Sakura replied when her silence demanded an answer. Who was a medic? Gozen-san replied sharply. I won't degrade her skills, they saved a lot of lives during the wars. But healing, that's been a woman's art since we came out of caves. And Tsunade-sama might seem ancient to you, but I can remember her as a child. My father never really reconciled himself to having a girl child. It wouldn't be until almost 7 years after I was born that my mother managed to give him the son he wanted. And her health was never the same again. Sakura was beginning to feel like an insect under a magnifying glass, Gozen-san cataloging her reactions to each revelation. I was taught very little, the old woman continued. But I decided that only I could make decisions for me, and I was going to be everything they told me I couldn't. I grew up in a time of war, so there was always the opportunity for practice. I experimented, tested, perfected dozens of genjutsu. I was the first female operative in Umbu. They declassified my file 5 years ago, so it's not quite a crime to admit that now. They called me the Foxwife. And I was the best damn saboteur they'd ever seen. Sakura swallowed nervously. What happened? She asked. Gozen-san's eyes narrowed. They tried to assign Uchiha to my squad. I'd never liked the Uchiha, even before then. Everything they saw, they thought was theirs to take. A technique perfected over a decade, copied in the space of 10 seconds. Did they eventually force you to take one on? The smile widened, and for a moment, if she pictured skin smooth with youth, she could see why they'd called her the Foxwife. I married a Hyuga and he moved into my house, she said, every word fierce with victory. The Hokage was wise enough to see that I would not stand for it, so that was it until after I retired. And then that proud man Uchiha Fugaku decided that it was beyond time that I pass on my techniques. I was an old woman, my husband was dead, and I had no children. And who better than this magnificent prodigy that happened to be his son? Uchiha Itachi called it an obligation, she spat. It was a good day the day he stormed out of this house. So you never taught him? No, Gozen-san said, some of the tenseness leaving the set of her shoulders. He was a strange, quiet child. After his father had had enough, he came to me in person. I was prepared to turn him down, but instead he apologized for his father's temper and his presumption. Killing his clan was the greatest favor he ever did for this village. Sakura couldn't react at all for a moment, her brain unable to process what Gozen-san had declared as decisively as her favorite type of jam. How can you say something like that? Sakura managed to force out at last, not quite shouting. Her mind was awhirl with the implications of that terrible, blasé statement. She hadn't realized she'd half risen out of her chair until Gozen-san said sharply, "Sit down. You were too young to remember what they were like. You have only stories, and too many people are afraid of telling evil stories about the dead. For now, take it as my opinion, and I am entitled to that." Sakura tried to swallow down the sick feeling, but it wouldn't leave her. "Did you ever teach anyone?" she asked, searching desperately for a question to ask when all she wanted to do was leave. "Not formally. And none of my techniques in full. The closest I ever came was with Orochimaru. There was a clever, curious child." "You're," Sakura shook her head. "A monster?" "Oh, probably. There comes a time when you're too old and too tired for hypocrisy, and I spent my youth keeping enemies awake for nights on end with terrors. I know what I am. And I thought I knew what you were. I thought Hatake had sent you, to make one last attempt at forcing me to choose someone to pass my techniques onto before I die. But as it turns out, you're just a genin who doesn't give up when faced with a mean old lady." She chuckled and withdrew her hands to her lap. "I've found you very helpful, Harano-chan. Until your sensei wakes up, I think I'd like to have you continue to help me. If you come back tomorrow, Gozen-san said as she shoved away from the table, there is one rule in this house, you assume nothing. What you think you know about your village, its history, its shinobi, washed in revisionist patriotism and the need to make things fit tidily into some half-hearted morality scheme, leave it at the door. Kill your heroes. Chapter 27. Alethephobia, Part I. The hard, unforgiving ridge of Kakashi-sensei's bookshelf dug into her shoulder where she'd pressed herself so tightly in the corner, but Sakura ignored it. She ignored Ahei, who was clutched tight against her chest, her knees drawn up on either side. Her forehead lay against the rise of his shoulders, a warm, breathing thing in her arms. She ignored them all, because she could not ignore what Gozen-san had told her. There was nothing worse than being told something awful about something you loved and finding no way to dispute it except primal, emotional denial. But, now that someone had called her attention to it, wasn't it strange? An entire clan had been massacred, but it had slipped so quietly into history that Sakura had almost forgotten it. At this, her face and ears burned, recalling a few very stupid comments she'd said to Sasuke after being assigned to Team 7. It had happened when she'd been very young enough that her impression of the event was limited to a sense of restlessness from the adults and Sasuke taking a long leave of absence from the academy. That was before her crush, back when Ino was the axis on which her social life revolved. She hadn't paid it any special kind of notice, any more than when Shino was sick for days at time as his body tried to adjust to hosting his colonies. In fact, before coming to Kakashi-sensei's, she'd actually gone to the library and spent hours in front of the microfilm viewer, reading back issues of the Konoha Daily. There'd only been a week of headline articles, then it had just slipped out of the village's social consciousness, appearing further and further back in the paper until it wasn't mentioned at all. She'd ignored the dirty look of the librarian as she'd retrieved the roll that had the edition of the paper released exactly a year after the massacre, but there'd been no mention of it. Almost like it never happened. Uchiha Itachi, she whispered to herself inside her head. She'd parroted that name back at Gozen-san, intuiting that he was someone she should have known from her tone and a vague recollection that it was a name she'd heard before. Until the papers, she hadn't realized that he was Sasuke's older brother, though reading it had reminded her that it had been a name she'd heard a lot at the academy. And then she hadn't, and not for a moment had she stopped to wonder why. The death of a clan, fallen almost entirely out of popular memory. Sakura shivered, wondering just what else had faded so easily out of the history she knew. The question wasn't whether she believed Gozen-san. The massacre had happened. That was indelible fact. Uchiha Itachi had been officially declared the perpetrator. That was what the papers said. People wouldn't have put it aside so quickly if they'd been better liked, if Gozen-san had been alone in her resentment of the Uchiha. That was what deductive reasoning said. The question was whether or not she wanted to go back to Gozen-san, to hear whatever else the foxwife might have to say. To live, every day, with the memories she would carry home. To hear things she didn't want to hear about her village and its heroes, who she wanted desperately to believe were good men. No, not good men, infallible men. Her grip on that belief was already pretty tenuous, thanks to Kakashi-sensei. Who came, but late. Always late. But if she didn't go back, some part of her mind said, that was like trapping a spider in a Tupperware container and shoving it into a cabinet. Some part of her would always feel like it had escaped and was biding its time, waiting for revenge. Better to kill it cleanly, better to know than not. It was easy to think that, but no part of her wanted to do it, any more than any part of her wanted to step onto another battlefield. Just curling into herself like this could still make her ache in half-real, half-remembered pain. But she would, she thought as her tears soaked silently into the fabric of Ahei's vest. She would. Kill your heroes. She'd cried against Ahei until she'd fallen asleep and woken many, many hours later to find the Ninken piled around her. That in a shower where she'd scrubbed herself until she was almost raw had given her enough courage to make the journey to Grandmother Nightmare's. She didn't knock on the door this time, because Gozen-san had given her permission on the third day to come inside without waiting for permission. The old woman was baking cookies when she opened the door, the whole house smelled like warm chocolate. And Sakura was sick to her stomach as she met Gozen-san's eyes. That wasn't the worst story, was it? She asked her quietly. There was nothing soft in Gozen Reiji's eyes when she responded to her question. The worst stories are not the ones we hear as words. They're the ones we feel in our hearts. For me, the worst story, she paused thoughtfully, and Sakura's hand slid to grasp her upper arm as she realized what it might mean, that Gozen-san had so many bad stories it took this long to choose a worst. The worst story, Gozen-san said at last, is of a selfish man and a willful woman for whom many sons and daughters died, just so they could have a son of their own blood. He knew and she knew even better exactly the stress it would put on the seal, but they did it anyway, because they were so strong and proud and clever that they thought that it was their chance to take. But it wasn't, not in the end. So many dead, all because they didn't have the sense to adopt and raise a child of the heart, rather than of the flesh. And he died for it, but did anyone think he'd gotten exactly what he'd deserved? Sakura was so still she wasn't certain she was even breathing, but Gozen-san's gaze was fixed somewhere in the past. No, she said softly, voice sharper than one of Sakura's knives. No. They whitewashed him and what he'd done and made him a hero, she sneered. And that is why it's the worst story. If there was anything redeeming about that terrible night, it was that at least they didn't manage to make a martyr out of other. Who was it? Sakura breathed. That, Gozen-san said, is classified. Sakura blinked at her, feeling strangely betrayed. Don't give me that look, child, she said. I am an angry, bitter old woman, but I will be a good shinobi until the day I die. And that means even bad orders are carried out. Now, she said, the weather's nice, so I'd like you to start by airing out the futons. Kill your heroes. Sakura had a fully grown Deathstalker scorpion in a glass sealed with wax paper and a rubber band at the top in one hand, her other hand swollen and not nearly numb enough beneath layers of ice, washcloth, and masking tape when Naruto bounded back into her life. Hey, Sakura-chan. She heard someone call from behind her as she explained her problem to the receiving nurse. She turned to look and found her teammate waving at her from the entrance, closely shadowed by a well-endowed blonde woman who followed him when he bolted forward. Sakura-chan. You'll never guess what then he checked himself, brows furrowed. Wait, are you okay? Or just here to visit Sasuke? Sakura stared blankly at him. Sasuke's here. It was his turn to stare. You don't. What's that in the glass there? The woman, who was accompanied by a slighter, darker woman she hadn't noticed earlier, said as she approached. Sakura frowned down at the aggressive scorpion, who was still trying to strike her hand through the glass. An object lesson, she muttered beneath her breath, about being misled by experience. When the woman raised a brow, Sakura flushed. A scorpion stung me while hanging up laundry on the line, ma'am. Now both brows soared, because Konoha didn't have any native species of scorpions, but then the nurse called Sakura's attention back to treatment of her throbbing hand. And that was the first time Sakura saw Senjutsunade, the third member of the Sunin. Konohagakure's legendary three, who might only have one among them openly called a traitor, but all of them had left the village. That was Gozen-san's first remark when Sakura brought her the news that Tsunade had returned to become the Go-Dame, after she'd been released from the hospital and had very grumpily returned Gozen-san's scorpion to her. Of course, by that point Sakura was convinced that the only people that Gozen-san respected and liked were the others who had survived careers as Umbu lifers. And those were a very, very few, most of them living nearby and many of whom Sakura had met as what Gemna-sensei had intended to be a D-class mission or two overran her life. But as Sakura listened to the murmur of the village, shamelessly eavesdropping on conversations as she ran errands, Gozen-san wasn't the only one who was less than forgiving about the formidable healing skills that Tsunade had deprived the village of when she'd left. There was a lot of talk centered on how many might have been saved in the wake of the invasion if she'd been there. Sakura had contradictory feelings about what she'd heard, read, and seen, but what concerned her more than the new Hokage was the first proper meeting of Team 7 since the invasion, which hadn't yet happened. Sasuke hadn't been released from the hospital yet, though she was going to go see him today. It felt, somehow, like she was going to that first meeting again, back when they'd only been genin candidates. It wasn't only that there were more dead men and scars between her and them again, though that was part of it. The time she'd spent learning not to flinch when whole passels of illusionary spiders rained down on her while changing a light bulb, Suzuki had spent in the hospital for a reason no one would tell her. While she'd listened to Gozen-san explain that insects were effective in genjutsu because people readily believed they were real and most found them disturbing en masse, while more fantastic illusions invited the brain to realize it was trapped in an illusion, Naruto had been off on some adventure with the Toad Sage. Even Kakashi-sensei. When she'd been breaking plates while washing dishes, slicing open veins and learning that the fears that really spoke to people, the ones hardest to shake off, were the ones rooted deeply in reality, he'd had Medicnin coming by to make certain his four was feeding correctly. But first, she had an audience with their new Hokage. She shifted restlessly, Kakashi-sensei occupying the time as they waited with his novel, which was somehow both irritating and reassuringly familiar. She was surprised to see Shikamaru and Asuma exit the Hokage's office, Shikamaru looking deeply unsatisfied with the Chunin vest tucked under one arm. His scowl disappeared briefly as he said, "Hey, Sakura," as they passed them. She managed to muster a smile in return, but then Kakashi-sensei was peeling himself from the wall and she followed him into the office. She knew the slighter, dark-haired woman as Shizune now, Tsunade-sama's apprentice, but she was a little bemused by the pygmy pig that came to snuffle at her foot. The blonde-haired woman waved them impatiently further in until they stood before her desk. "So, Kakashi," she said, "it seems you have a whole passel of extraordinary students." Hazel eyes fixed on Sakura, who struggled not to squirm. "Haruno Sakura." "Yes, ma'am." Sakura responded, and it was only because of time spent with Gozen-san that she didn't squeak. If her voice was a little higher than normal, it was because the part of her brain that would forever live in the academy regarded the office of the Hokage with more than a little awe. Despite the interruption of the exams, upon review of their performances, 2 of your year mates received promotions today, Tsunade informed her, settling her chin on interlaced fingers. You, however, were eliminated during the preliminaries after the second section. "Yes, ma'am," Sakura replied, swallowing down the memory of that match. "Normally, that would be the end of it. However, I received a recommendation for your promotion from a jounin." Sakura's eyes automatically swept over to Kakashi-sensei, who raised a brow. "A field promotion?" he asked Tsunade-sama. Sakura couldn't quite work out the complexities of his tone. "Yes," she replied. "The jounin was not the only one who came to me with something to say. A handful of chunin came to me and were very insistent that it would be very embarrassing for them go on mistaking a genin for a chunin. After that, I pulled your files." Those hazel eyes narrowed. "I was more than a little surprised by what I found. It's a record that almost seems like it shouldn't belong to a genin brought up in peacetime, but it is what it is. As of this moment, you have the highest kill count of anyone in your graduating class, but that alone isn't enough to make chunin." She raised her head off her hands, lips compressed into a thin, unhappy line. "Personally, I dislike field promotions. We only see them regularly in wartime and that was something I wanted to leave far behind. But neither can I ignore the needs of my village, which will be asking a lot from its shinobi for months, likely years as we rebuild our military strength. I'd like to give you at least another year of field experience, but circumstances being what they are, I'm going to reward you for your sacrifices in the past by asking more of you tomorrow. As of today, Haruno Sakura, you are a chunin of Konohagakure. Congratulations. Kill your heroes." Chapter 28. Alethephobia, Part 2. Sakura worried at the fabric of her chunin flak jacket as they descended the stairs in the tower, ignoring the way she was destroying the neatly pressed creases. It would have to be sent out to be tailored regardless, general sizing not suitable for something meant to protect her life. Kakashi-sensei glanced down at her, for once sends his novel. Sakura bit her lip. "Do I have to wear it?" she asked him softly. "You know you don't," Kakashi-sensei pointed out, "but not wearing the vest isn't going to change the fact that you're chunin." "I don't," she fumbled for words, in the end managing only a plaintive, "Why?" When her eyes flickered over to Kakashi-sensei, he looked grim. "You already know the answer to that one as well, Sakura," he replied, mildly admonishing. "Our effective military strength took an enormous blow. But we can't admit it. You're only the first field promotion we'll see, not the last." Sakura nodded slowly, because that was something she did understand. Kakashi-sensei looked away from her as he continued speaking. Tsunade-sama was very vocally against field promotions outside of wartime, back when she lived in the village. She thought that they only considered ability, without the stability or emotional maturity to use that ability well. Do you think she was right? Sakura prodded cautiously. The corner of Kakashi-sensei's mouth visible to her tilted up. Except for when I became a genin, my rank was awarded through field promotions. But that was wartime. Field promotions couldn't really have been avoided, not without crippling ourselves. Not even Tsunade-sama would disagree with that, though she wasn't really happy about mine, but after that I met someone who never sat for an exam in his career. And when he went wrong, he took a lot of people with him, he said darkly. Uchiha Itachi, Sakura guessed, but kept silent on that topic. She wasn't ready to discuss the massacre with Kakashi-sensei. Because that would lead to Gozen-san and the things she had to say, and she wanted to keep that part of her life as far from the rest of it as she could. To pretend, just a little while longer, that it wasn't something that seeped into everything, spoiling her world of black and white with all sorts of shades of gray. And spiders. Do you think that I deserved to be promoted? She forced herself to ask instead. Kakashi-sensei didn't answer for a long time, and she was almost certain he wasn't going to answer at all when he spoke. I think things would be much easier for you if you'd had more field experience. I agree with Tsunade-sama on that. All of your missions have either been deranks or assignments gone sour. But while she might be hurting for personnel, but she's being careful about who she's promoting. Someone else might have promoted every genin who made it into the final round. She didn't. Instead, she promoted you, the Nara, and the Abarame boy. It wasn't a decision based solely on the exam. Both of the boys also managed to detect and escape the genjutsu on their own and contribute to the village's defense, even if the Nara required a little motivation. That was probably why she decided against promoting Rock Lee, who is highly skilled but also dangerously specialized due to his disadvantages. I don't doubt that he'll make Chunin, but he'll really have to work for it. He shook off his speculations, reaching out to ruffle her hair. Don't look like that, Sakura, he told her. I might not be certain you're ready, but you deserved the promotion. She stared back. That makes no sense, she protested. I am a deeply complicated man, he told her. She kept her gaze fixed on him a moment longer, then deliberately turned away. Yes, Kakashi-sensei. Do I detect sarcasm from my student? He asked, this time rapping his knuckles gently against the side of her head. Though, technically, you can call me Kakashi-senpai now. Sakura felt her stomach clench with panic at the implications of that, but Kakashi-sensei rapped her with his knuckles again. When you feel ready, he said. Until then, you've got a team that still needs to earn their own promotions. You'll probably be asked to take on missions without them for now, just like I will, but you're still a part of Team 7. And even when you aren't with us, Chunin still operate on squads and aren't sent on A-rank assignments like what Wave turned out to be. Her fingers slowly unclenched from the fabric of her vest. I'm really glad you're alright, she said with sudden fierceness. I could say the same, Kakashi-sensei replied. Considering our record and how long I was unavailable, I'm surprised you didn't have to thwart another invasion. I want the extra key to my apartment back, he added casually. Sakura frowned and did not look at him when she muttered, no. You have hard locks. I could change them, he suggested. You won't, Sakura said. And I won't tell Naruto or Sasuke where you live. Fair enough, Kakashi-sensei conceded after another long moment. But you will stop alphabetizing my novels. Kill your heroes. As they entered the hospital, Kakashi-sensei disappeared for a follow-up appointment that Tsunade-sama herself had told him in no uncertain terms that he would actually appear for. If she gambled, she'd put money on him making an escape within the first 3 minutes. Sakura was left to shrug on her new flak vest. His advice was that it was better that her teammates find out now rather than later and ask for directions to Sasuke's room. The mystery of why Kakashi-sensei and Sasuke would be hospitalized or hospitalized in Kakashi-sensei's case at the same time gnawed at her, amplified by the fact that everyone had refused to tell her what was wrong with either of them. And she'd seen Kakashi-sensei, who hadn't had wounds of the visible and gaping kind. That left either poison or genjutsu, but knowing that brought only more guesses. Kakashi-sensei would never tell her, but Sasuke might. But Sasuke was going to be displeased. She winced at her own understatement, because Sasuke was going to be furious and Naruto was going to be upset, but she did think that Kakashi-sensei was probably right. Just as he'd been when he'd forced her to confront the reality of Sasuke's chakra nature and all the ninjutsu of his clan. Better now, in the relative safety of the village, than in the field. It didn't really make the prospect any more pleasant. When she came to the room she'd been directed to, she double-checked the room number and spent several minutes straightening her clothes and smoothing her hair. Anything to delay actually opening the door, but at last she slid it open with a quick, decisive movement. And found nothing. No one, she quickly amended, because the covers of the bed were tossed back in such a way that suggested someone had gotten up in a hurry. All her nervousness transmuting to irritation, Sakura considered where they might have gone. They likely hadn't actually left the hospital. Sasuke wasn't Kakashi-sensei after all, but she couldn't actually see Sasuke intentionally loitering in public spaces like one of the waiting rooms. She bit down harder on her lip as she considered how likely it was they'd gone somewhere that wasn't a public space. Sasuke might drop honorifics, but he didn't usually go out of his way to break rules. But as far as Naruto was concerned, as his record at the academy had proven, doors meant to keep him out were mostly a suggestion. More than one of their instructors had asked him snidely if he could read. With that in mind, she had an idea where they might be. Her eyes skittered nervously over the corridor as she slunk to the stairwell, easing the door shut. It would be just her luck if Naruto and Sasuke had come through without anyone noticing and someone caught her on the way up. She wasn't like her blonde teammate, she didn't have much experience with being in trouble with adults. And, despite how pathetic it seemed, she still felt that same nervous pinch in her belly when she thought about being yelled at. For all the dead men between her and the academy, she was still in many ways that good child who thought rules existed for a reason. But she made it safely to the rooftop and found the door that led onto the roof not quite shut all the way. She would have crept out cautiously. It could have been a member of the staff after all, but she heard the sharp, unmistakable shriek of Kunao grinding against one another. Sakura darted out, but even as two familiar figures came into sight, she heard another sound. The sound of 1,000 birds chirping, they'd said. Chidori. And there was Naruto, the air in the palm of his hand twisting and distorting, and both of them were roaring, Sasuke swooping down like a bird of prey and Naruto reared back like something too large for Sasuke's talons to close on. She didn't recognize Naruto's attack, but in the instant she had to perceive the battle, she knew he thought it would be a match for Chidori, else he'd have turned to his clones. This wasn't a friendly fight, she thought numbly. This had turned into a death match. Her irritation tangled up with her fear and it spilt over into movement. Her eyes saw everything, slow as a flower blooming, her body swift as the strike of lightning in that moment. Sakura's hands closed well behind their wrists, but the crackling energy of Sasuke's Chidori leapt the gap and she screamed as her muscles spasmed involuntarily and they both slid free of her grip. She'd half-turned, just enough that their hands drove into the roof rather than each other, Sasuke's wrist sinking in elbow-deep while Naruto's hand left a twisted crater in its wake. Sakura could only stare, chest heaving with unsteady breaths, one hand clutched tight over the aching trail of Sasuke's attack. "What were you thinking?" she demanded in a shrill voice, backing away from both of them. "Sakura-chan?" Naruto asked shakily, picking himself up. Sasuke had to struggle more to pull himself free, but his eyes widened slightly when they landed on Sakura. "You could have killed each other," Sakura said numbly. "You would have killed each other." "It's not," Naruto's half-hearted protest died in his throat. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said instead. Sasuke's eyes flickered toward Naruto, dropping to the crater at his feet and lingered there with such intensity Sakura wanted to flinch away from him, then back to Sakura. "What are you wearing?" he asked her, voice harder than she'd ever heard it. Sakura forced herself to lower her hands, though there was stinging, burning welt all along one arm from the path of the electrical energy. She tried to ignore it and the part of her brain occupied in reliving just how close she'd come to knowing the same kind of force that had once pierced Gaara's sand. She straightened her back and tucked in her chin and said, "My Chunin vest." Sasuke's eyes narrowed, but Naruto's reaction was far more flattering. His jaw dropped briefly, but then a wide grin swept across his face. Obasan promoted you. You were eliminated in the preliminaries, Sasuke said sharply. It was a field promotion, Sakura replied. Sasuke's eyes were accusing and cherry non-red. You weren't even there for the fight against Gaara, he growled. Why would you merit a promotion? Hey, Naruto interjected, that's not fair, Sasuke. You know Sakura stayed behind so that we could reach you in time to save your scrawny butt. Sasuke's lips twisted in a snarl, but Sakura snapped, stop it. Just, stop, she said, more softly. We're already going to be in trouble for the state of this roof. Don't make it worse. What we're even fighting over, anyway? The fact that Sasuke's an idiot, Naruto grumbled. As far as I'm concerned, came Kakashi-sensei's dry voice, you're all idiots. Kakashi-sensei. Naruto said eagerly, while Sasuke and Sakura stayed silent. Kakashi-sensei's single visible eye swept over them, taking in the scene. Well, he said. This one I've got to hear. Kill your heroes. Chapter 29. Chronophobia, Part I. When no one immediately spoke, Sakura was cringing in anticipation, Naruto shamefaced but stubborn because Sasuke wasn't speaking, and Sasuke wearing the iciest expression he could muster. Kakashi sighed. Fine. We'll do it your way, Kakashi-sensei said flatly. Sakura, when your teammates have decided that the best way to settle their differences is a public duel, I don't care about the property damage you caused separating them. That'll come out of their pay. Is your arm all right? When she hesitated, glancing over at Sasuke, who was pointedly not looking at her, he ordered, go have someone look at that. Now? Sakura asked, because though it hurt, she'd been really hurt before. And this conversation seemed like a very important one. His single visible eye narrowed, but when she tucked in her chin and met his stare mulishly, he relented. I suppose you're owed just as much of an explanation as I am, since you're the one who ended it. Now, who wants to tell me why it seemed like a good idea to use lethal techniques to settle your differences? I didn't teach you Chidori to have you use it against your teammate, Sasuke, any more than Jiraiya would have taught you that particular technique if he'd known what use you'd put it to, Naruto. I don't care if you lost your temper. I don't care that you didn't think that wouldn't have made either of you any less dead if Sakura hadn't interfered. From the moment you step past the academy doors, you're taught to respect your weapons, that they're tools, not toys. Ninjutsu isn't any different. Yes, Kakashi-sensei, Naruto agreed miserably, staring down at his hand and then clenching it into a fist. I wasn't thinking. I was just so pissed. But it won't happen again, he promised. Because, just cause you didn't mean it doesn't mean anything, not if someone gets hurt. Kakashi-sensei spared the remorseful genin a brief smile. There are always accidents during training and no will hold those against you, but that is one technique that is never appropriate to use during sparring. Naruto, glancing down at the crater he'd left, winced, and nodded. Attention turned to Sasuke, whose eyes were shadowed by temper, not regret. He scowled at Kakashi-sensei, lips barely parting as he muttered, got it. Kakashi-sensei's brow rose. Really? He queried. Then I suppose you won't mind walking Sakura down and explaining why she has minor electrical burns. There were clear lines of tension in Sasuke's jaw as he stalked toward the door. Sakura wasn't certain whether she was meant to follow, but when he reached the door, he turned and gave a look that was a silent demand to follow. She trailed him silently, Naruto staying behind with Kakashi-sensei. She could hear the low, indistinct murmur of their voices as she followed her dark-haired teammate down the empty stairwell. Once Sasuke had made her uncomfortable through sheer embarrassment, too afraid of looking less than her best to ever really be at ease with him. Now it was unease that made the hair on her arms prickle as their footsteps echoed, the stairwell creating a sense of intimacy despite the people that were just on the other side of the doors. She'd feared fire first and conquered that fear, but now it was Sasuke himself. Or, perhaps, a Sasuke less than himself. Sakura couldn't forget him in the grips of that seal, and though she couldn't see that livid, living tattoo peeking from under his collar, the look on his face as he'd launched himself at Naruto bore an awful resemblance to the one he'd worn back then. She was occupied with considering the idea of never really feeling safe with Sasuke again when he spoke. Thank you, he grunted, almost too soft for her to hear. Sakura didn't have to ask him to clarify. She still didn't feel comfortable, the scent of sweat and ozone too much for that as he paused to let her catch up, but she felt better, lighter somehow. Team 7 might never be Team 10, but there was still time for them to find their own balance. Kill your heroes. Sakura had just gotten her vest back from tailoring when she received the notice from the mission office. Zipping up the vest and settling it as comfortably as she could manage over her habitual outfit, she wasn't going to wear the standard uniform unless it was a formal occasion. Sakura was surprised to find that her trepidation was almost swallowed by her eagerness to not see the reminders of the recent invasion whenever she stepped out the door. Also, a mission would distract her from the fact that her mother was coming home. Just for a little while on leave, but it would be long enough. Sakura didn't know if she could or should tell her about everything that had happened since she'd become a genin. She'd been worried enough that her daughter had already made Chunin. Proud, yes, but worried, just as she'd been when she'd heard about Sakura's team roster. Her mother's team had drifted apart when two of its members had taken support positions and the other had been absorbed by another team undergoing similar growing pains as young genin found career paths they wanted to follow. Her father's team, by contrast, had remained intact. The Sakura first assigned to Team 7 had thought she'd follow Sasuke anywhere, but now, a little more battered and a little wiser, she could read between the lines of her mother's letter and see that Mabuki had hoped that she'd find her calling a little further from the battlefield. Her mother clearly knew what a field promotion implied. Konoha had taken her heaviest casualties among her field shinobi. With this promotion, without a non-combat specialization, her career as it stood ended in an urn or as a jounin. Sakura bundled all that up and set it aside as best she could as she reported to the mission office. The Hokage herself was giving mission briefs this morning, which gave Sakura an additional incentive to nervousness above and beyond the absence of her teammates. Shino was there, however, and Tenten slid in the door only moments after Sakura. Sakura's brows soared even higher when Hinata peeked around the door, then was gently shoved inside by Ino. The five of them, well, all right. The four girls stared curiously at one another as Tsunade-sama finished briefing an older team on a C rank. When the door had closed beyond them, they were waved forward. Well, Tsunade-sama said, resting her chin on her interlaced hands, here's your first taste of a mission outside of your genin team, without any jounin to supervise. I'll do broad strokes for you. The details will be provided in the mission packet. There's a Ryokan in the south that's been having some trouble with a group of bandits that have moved into the area. We suspect the bandits of having some ninja training, because local law enforcement hasn't been able to track them back to their base. It's a small group, no more than 10, and on the grounds of the inn they've confined themselves so far to making lewd comments to the Nakai and demanding food be prepared and served. But they're growing more aggressive about harassing the girls, and recently the travelers they've been accosting aren't just being robbed, they're being badly beaten as well. In our last communication with Jun-san, it was done basically at her doorstep. So, before any of her Nakai are raped or any of her guests murdered, Jun-san commissioned us to take care of her problem. You three genin are going to replace the Nakai, several of whom have returned home until the problem is taken care of. A Ryokan's reputation is its lifeblood, which is why Jun-san isn't willing to let her service of what guests are still coming to suffer while we get the rest of it straightened out. In theory, you're young enough that even if the bandits think that you're shinobi, they won't consider you a threat. Your leads for this mission will be Abarame and Harano, who have the responsibility of tracking the bandits, restraining them, and turning them over to law enforcement. Understood. A somewhat ragged chorus of affirmatives answered the Hokage, who nodded sharply. She plucked a manila folder from the chaos of the desk and proffered it. Sakura glanced over at Shino, who tilted his head toward the Hokage. So it was Sakura who went forward to take the folder. Weighing its weight in her hand, she suggested they adjourn somewhere else to go over the details and was met with ready agreement. The thought of facing 10 men might have made her more nervous with a different partner, but if they only suspected that they had ninja training, she had some confidence that Shino's Kikaicha would at least negate their ninjutsu. It worried her a little that they were only supposed to subdue them, but she'd cross that bridge when they came to it. Once they'd left the tower, it was Ino would took the lead, finding them a neat little cafe whose walled courtyard offered them almost total privacy this early in the morning. Inside the folder were printed packets for each of them, Sakura and Shino's different from the others, and a handful of photographs and topographic maps of the area. They studied the information in relative silence, Ino badgering them for their orders and reciting it faultlessly back at the waiter when he appeared until everyone had read over the data at least once. Sakura, by virtue of practice, apparently read faster than anyone else, and she'd only read it over a second time out of habit. Her memorization scores were even better than Ino's. "This sounds like it might be fun," Ino offered. "Well, for the three of us, at least." Tenten grinned. "I have to admit, there hasn't been much call for dressing up on my team's missions before. I haven't worn a kimono since kunoichi classes, though. Unless you count yukata." "No worries," Ino reassured her. She flipped her long ponytail back over her shoulder with her hand in an exaggerated movement. "We'll have your feminine wiles up to par in no time. And Hinata-chan should be even more used to kimono than I am, right?" Hinata flushed at being addressed directly and ducked her head. "Yes," she answered in a small voice. "If it comes to looking demure in anything, I'd take Hinata-san's advice over Ino's," Sakura confided to Tenten. "Ino always managed to look one photographer short of a glamour shot whenever we did formal wear. It was the only thing our kunoichi instructors ever criticized her about." "I can't decide if that was supposed to be an insult or a really backhanded compliment," Ino retorted. "Hinata-chan, you do already own cosmetic contacts, don't you?" "Yes," the girl replied, more firmly this time. "Do you have to wear them too, Ino-san?" "Not for the same reason you do," Ino said with a smile. "I'm unlikely to be kidnapped or anything, but if I want to pass as a civilian, my eyes are kind of a dead giveaway." Sakura glanced over at Shino and asked tentatively, "Do you think we'll have trouble with our end of the assignment?" She'd never been close to the shinobi in the academy, finding the idea of bugs living beneath his skin too much for more than politeness, but that was before she'd watched spiders drip down out a leak in the ceiling. Sakura was far from liking them, but she was confident she wouldn't embarrass herself or him by shrieking. "There should be no issues," Shino responded after a moment's consideration. "Weighing their numbers and what intelligence we have on them against our collective skills, barring unexpected circumstances, we should find them only a moderate challenge." Given how closely Shino's analysis paralleled her own, she wasn't surprised to find her own confidence buoyed, though she winced at the mention of unexpected circumstances. When they dispersed to pack their own supplies, Sakura and Ino were left to walk home together, which was deeply nostalgic. Especially as Ino was clearly anticipating the mission, but away from an audience she was quieter than most people suspected. Social engineer, mood maker, trendsetter, all those things were true, but that wasn't all that she was. They walked in almost comfortable silence for a long time, but then Ino spoke. "I'm glad," she told Sakura. "We never really got to work together much in the academy when we started running practice scenarios, because, well, you don't want to put the first and second ranked kunoichi on the same team. And we don't really hang out anymore." "I miss that," she said, tone turning wistful. "Mom and Dad keep asking if we've made peace over the Uchiha and wondering if you'll start coming over to eat again. I've tried coming to your house to ask, but you're either ignoring me or you're never home." "Not ignoring you," Sakura responded. "Even when we were fighting over Sasuke, I couldn't manage that." "I don't think anyone could," she said slyly, which made Ino grin. I am busy and the house feels empty with Dad still gone. I do training sessions in the morning, then if I'm lucky there's a solo D rank open for me. If not, I go to the library. Kakashi-sensei is a huge fan of assigned reading, because it's like training me but without any effort on his part. Then there's this one old lady that I've been helping out in the afternoon. I was doing D ranks for her for a while, but now I just go," she admitted. What she didn't admit was the amount of time she'd spent lurking in Kakashi's apartment while he'd been in a coma, or that the old lady was a large part of the reason she didn't want to be alone in her own home. Ino eyed her until Sakura shifted uncomfortably. "You should come over once we get back," the blonde said. "I know that you've seen and done things that I haven't yet, but I don't think that's a good enough reason to let you deal with it by yourself. I let you try to end our friendship once over Sasuke and I shouldn't have done that. And I shouldn't have just let you walk away the last time, either," she remarked. "You know you could always talk to my dad, if you need to talk to someone." He's super good at keeping secrets. In the job description. Sakura offered in an echo of an old joke. In the job description, Ino confirmed with a grin, but it faded quickly. You don't look like you're sleeping at all, Sakura. And trust me, your looks need all the help they can get. Sakura scoffed. I'm fine, she lied. Ino replied in the tone of the unconvinced. Right, well, I'm just going to go pack. Are really going to wear that vest with that outfit. For now. All the extra pockets might make up for the fact that it is likely the most unflattering thing I've ever worn. At least until I can afford a ceiling scroll. I didn't realize how expensive they were. You're bending space-time with chakra, Ino pointed out as she stopped at the door to her house. You think that would come cheap? Kill your heroes. Chapter 30. Chronophobia, Part 2. As Sakura walked beneath the great gates that led out from the village, she experienced a pang of anxiety and had to master the sudden need to look back at Konoha for reassurance. Wave was an anomaly, like one of the great trees falling while you happened to be standing under it. Tragic for you, but if it happened to everyone, no one would go walking in the forest. She fretted with her new, freshly laundered shemug gray with olive drab and tried to convince herself that she'd met her quota of missions gone bad. She didn't really believe it, which was why she'd tried to anticipate what might go wrong. She had enough Kevlar cord stashed in her vest pockets to rappel down the village's walls, she'd packed extra rations and a spare canteen in her backpack, 2 canisters of a tear gas mixture were a reassuring weight in another set of vest pockets, with one of a sleeping gas solution on the other side, these with internal pressurization, and she'd thought to pack a mask and spare herself the sore throat, and she'd brought along her blunted practice kunao from the academy in an effort to comply with the subdue order without resorting entirely to hand. Her chakra-enhanced strength could make the advantages of greater height and weight nil, but while she could punch hard, her control wasn't to the point where she could trust it would be just hard enough. For now it was a matter of all in or all out, which was fine if her aim was to irreversibly rupture something. Though even her all-in didn't even begin to compare to what real chakra-enhanced strength could be like. Tsunade-sama's first temper tantrum in the practice fields had evoked a strangled kind of awe, because it looked more like the work of a natural disaster than a person. She'd handily won the concession she'd wanted from the council, at least according to the rumors that had whipped through the village. She glanced to one side as Ino gave a pleased sigh, her arms stretched high above her head, sunlight making her blonde hair shine. The girl noticed her look and grinned. Oh, come on, she inveigled. There are literally days before we arrive. That gives us plenty of time to be somber and serious later. Today the sun is shining, it's my first C-rank mission without the 2 doofuses I've been paired with since forever, and we are being useful to our village in a way that doesn't make me feel like I'm still an academy student. She makes good points, Tenten said with a laugh. Now, if you can keep that attitude up after a day in the trees, I'll be impressed. We are taking the tree road? Not running, right? Shino turned toward her, his high collar and glasses making his expression difficult to read. For what purpose would we run? In terms of weighing energy efficiency against speed of travel, the tree road represents a stamina-forgiving mode of travel without significant loss of speed. Just asking, Tenten responded. Guy-sensei is a fiend. He makes us run everywhere, I swear. Some days I think someone told him he's training a team of courier nin. That sounds awful, Hinata ventured timidly. Well, some days it is. But in the interest of fairness, I am a fantastic long-distance runner by this point. And I never have to count carbs. Lucky, Ino said in good-humored envy. But no thanks. So, to the trees, oh fearless leaders. Sakura scoffed, but Shino ignored the sarcasm. Yes. There is no reason to delay and every reason to press forward. Being in the trees didn't hinder the steady ebb and fall of conversation, though Shino contributed only rarely. Not because he didn't want to intrude or felt unwelcome, Sakura thought or at least hoped, but because he didn't have anything of note to contribute and Shino didn't do idle conversation. It was an easy 3-day trip by the tree road to their destination, which was located on the peninsula, almost on the border between Fire and Tea. On the evening of the second day, when they were approaching the area they'd tentatively identified as the thieves' territory, their squad split. Tenten, Ino, and Hinata would spend the night as civilians at a way station and continue by themselves on foot, while Sakura and Shino kept to the trees and pressed ahead. They scouted the road as they went, not willing to chance the others facing an ambush, but the roads were clear and Sakura caught her first sight of Miyako Azure, which was a large, gracious-looking inn that abutted the ocean. It wasn't a straight drop down into the waves, but rather a stepped series of rocky shelves that someone had thoughtfully carved steps into. Unwise to visit in unpleasant weather, but with today's waves only lapping contently against the lowest shelf, it was no surprise to see a yukata-clad guest staring out over the water. The height of the trees dropped sharply and changed composition as they came nearer to the ocean, but the forest never disappeared entirely, the man-made elements blending almost seamlessly into their surroundings. The titular tea flowers were blooming in profusion around the landward side of the inn where there was protection from the salt spray. All in all, it shot a bolt of envy through Sakura, who would be camping out for the duration. But then again, she reminded herself, she'd much rather be a guest than part of the staff. She'd never had any natural grace at most of the kunoichi classes, Ikebana memorably included, though through hard work and Ino's assistance and that of Ino's mother she'd mustered sufficient skill to see them through. She shoved away the thought that serving guests didn't normally include being involved in a fight weighted against her in terms of numbers, concentrating instead on how terrified she'd always been when she'd had to mind her sleeves and stride length aside from whatever task she'd been asked to do. Though they didn't have any reason to believe that the inn was under active surveillance, Jun-san might have paid for their services, but the attacks had focused on the roads. Shino swept the grounds with his beetles. Sakura tried to avoid staring or averting her eyes as the insects crawled up the backs of Shino's hands to disappear inside his sleeves, but her mind was attempting mathematics of the unnerving kind as it tried to calculate how many beetles could reasonably be concealed by Shino's heavy clothing. A lot, came the answer, but she stopped that line of thought when she started imagining she could hear the rustle of their movement and the clatter of tiny mandibles. Genjutsu came in two forms, invocative and evocative. To be truly good at the first, Gozen-san insisted, you need an imagination with an eye for detail. Which was well and good, Sakura reflected darkly, until you found that you were scaring yourself silly. She came out of her thoughts to find Shino staring at her and she flushed. There appear to be no hidden watchers, he reported. We should make contact with Jun-san. Yeah, Sakura replied awkwardly, letting him take the lead as they made for Jun-san's office. The interview with the client that followed was brisk and professional, the lady just as elegant as her house, and she had kunoichi class composure. She'd given them fuller details on the attacks, and when Shino had left to suss out the best locations for their daytime post, she worked with Sakura in identifying the precise location of the attacks on their topography map. When Sakura left with just as much care as she'd taken coming in, she had a moment's anxiety before Shino dropped down from a nearby tree. The males can follow the pheromone trails of a female, he explained at her unspoken question, adjusting his sunglasses on the bridge of his nose. I planted one on you earlier. I did not ask your permission. Why? Because I thought you might be irrationally upset. My observations in the past revealed an unfounded fear of insects common among females, though perhaps preferable to the male response which uses violence to cover a similar unease. Sakura frowned at him. I'm more upset at not being asked than the beetle. I'm not in any danger of squishing her by accident, am I? She perceives and processes visual information 3 times faster than the human brain, so that significantly reduces your chances of crushing her, Shino reassured her. Judging by the behavior of the males, she's in the folds of your scarf, just behind your right ear. Just so long as little insect feet are far from bare skin, Sakura said, ignoring the instinctive EU factor, noticing only now the pinky nail-sized beetles tracing patterns in the air near her head. I haven't completely mastered my involuntary swat reflex. Shino nodded gravely. Understood. He led her to the sites he'd scouted and they settled in after they briefly visited the site of the most recent attack. They discovered it wasn't incompetence on the part of the local police, who'd tried to use dogs. A recent rain in the area combined with basic track concealment skills meant there wasn't much to go on as their targets had sufficient ninja skill to travel by the tree road. Shino directed swarms of a dozen beetles each to settle in the footpaths, road, and among the branches of some of the likely trees. They'd return immediately if they were disturbed, or that was his explanation of what he was doing when he caught Sakura staring. As he'd been completely silent, doing nothing more than staring intently at his hands, which had been covered in beetles, she was more than a little unnerved. Carrying out instructions that complex was more credit than she'd given to Shino's swarm. Living proximity traps that would escape the notice of all but the most observant, she could see how that might be very useful skill to have on a team like his. For her part, she studied their newly embellished map and spent the afternoon establishing a search area. Ideally there would be another incident and they would have a fresh trail, otherwise they were going to attempt to follow that thoroughly sketchy trail and would need all the assistance they could get. She was tucked close to the trunk of a tree, her shemagh tied over her distinctive hair, when the other three girls made their appearance. All three had changed into casual civvies and took the time to really admire Miyako Azure, Ino's voice drifting up to her perch. Another strike of envy, this one harder to shove away. But she did, eventually, one hand coming up to sweep her fingers along the slick raised ridge of her latest scar. Next week she saw the specialist again. Shino was different from both of her teammates, he hardly even shifted for hours at a time, but whereas Suzuki probably wouldn't have initiated conversation if they'd waited a week, on their second day she found him in her tree. His attempt at conversation was awkward. And Sakura finally understood after knowing him for the better part of a decade that his speech habit of asking questions and answering himself was at least partially a nervous tell. He wasn't like Naruto, who could natter on forever, or Ino, who could conjure conversational topics. He was instead bluntly interested in how much she'd changed from the academy and the experiences and training that had caused it. The way he phrased it made it seem less like a personal interest than a kind of scientific curiosity, as if he'd identified a kind of caterpillar only to be surprised at what emerged from the cocoon. No matter why he wanted to know, Sakura wasn't about to share. She tried to be polite, but she was afraid all her words had slightly jagged edges. So she was therefore very surprised when he tried to use a very basic tactic, reciprocity, to draw it out of her. They were 3 days in without so much as news of the bandits, though they were going to give it one more day. According to the pattern, they were almost overdue for another attack. By this point, Sakura was immensely tired of waiting in trees for something to happen and was on the verge of thinking that perhaps Kakashi-sensei's bring-a-book mentality wasn't far off the mark. Not porn, though. She was nowhere near that desperate for entertainment. The speculation that all my beetles dwell inside my body is erroneous, Shino commented, which tore her out of contemplating how uncomfortable tree branches were as prolonged seating. Only the females nest inside my body, which causes the males to swarm. If you were to attempt to host an entire colony, even a small one, your muscle structure would be so compromised as to be non-functional. As it is, space inside the abdominal cavity is limited, which creates a limit on how many beetles I can host. Much of my physical training is devoted to improving my core strength, so that my abdominal wall provides sufficient protection. Sakura half turned to glance at him, but as he was on the opposite side of the trunk, she could only see the edge of one sleeve. Like bees? She ventured. No. You're thinking of worker bees, which are non-reproductive females except in exceptional circumstances when a hive becomes queenless. The females are more intelligent and they do coordinate the males, so it's not an unreasonable comparison, but it has significant shortcomings in understanding the social structure of a Kikaicha swarm. Sakura made a thoughtful noise in the back of her throat. Wouldn't this be considered an Abarame clan secret? No. This would be clear upon close observation to anyone with reasonable deductive skills. Making the symbiosis functional and breeding the Kikaicha to possess desired traits would be considered secret. Something has disturbed several of the Trioad swarms, he said, shifting instantly back into a professional mien. Sakura tensed but didn't move to look immediately. The human eye fixed on movement quicker than it did shape. She saw the flight of beetles returning and very slowly shifted so that she could catch glimpses of bodies moving through the trees. She could hear them too, which was reassuring as a measure of their skill level. When they were well past Shino, and she slunk closer to Miyako Azure. Laid out along the length of a branch, Shino somewhere below her, Sakura got her first decent glimpse of their targets through her field glasses. Judging by their silhouettes, they were all male, and slighter of build than she'd expected. Young. Her mind posited. That might make sense. Dissatisfied young men who didn't have the skill to be promoted but had plenty of skill to terrorize civilians. Even Konohagakure lost track of a few genin and would-be genin each year, a number that had spiked exponentially in the wake of the invasion. She couldn't confirm her guess as to their age, because they all wore grinning O&I masks that only exposed their faces below the nose. Her grip tightened as she saw Jun-san exit the inn to greet her guests, trailed by 3 familiar fellow genin. They trust you to do your job, Sakura reminded herself, now trust them to do theirs. Hinata put on the most convincing show of being cowed, but she did it almost too well. One of the bandits strutted up to her, tugging at her bangs hard enough to make the blue-haired girl wince. Ino's nature wouldn't let that pass without comment, which earned her a hard backhand, but one of the men, the leader, snapped something at the man who'd struck her. He stepped away, though the one who was speaking to Hinata stepped closer to her and said something that made the girl blush ferociously. And then they were inside, and Sakura could only wait and hope that nothing went wrong inside, because her mission was very clear. She felt the branch she was on shift and turned her gaze away from the view provided by her field glasses to find Shino crouched just behind her feet. Here, he murmured, pulled something from one of the cavernous pockets of his jacket. With another glance toward the inn, Sakura let her feet drop to either side of the branch and shoved herself upright. Tucking her field glasses pack into her pouch, she reached out to accept what he offered. Zip ties. She whispered back. With a flexible metal core, Shino confirmed. Why? Because it requires metal snips to remove, making escape unlikely. My mother specializes in live retrieval. Thanks, Sakura said, surprised by the gesture, but Shino had already dropped back to his branch. Sakura tucked away the handful of zip ties, which fit awkwardly into her own pockets. Each of them had taken one quick bathroom break by the time the bandits emerged, which left them immediately prepared to follow. Shino's females had positioned themselves near the inn's exits, which made it an easy task for them to drop unnoticed onto the bandits' clothing. They waited until there was a sufficient distance for stealth, and then Shino led the way. It was a longer journey than Sakura had anticipated, almost on the edge of the search grid she'd established. There were no recorded cave systems in the area and no houses, so they were surprised to see that the entire group slipped inside an almost invisible crevice that looked like nothing so much as an elongated natural sinkhole. Once inside, they were equally astonished to find a vast, linked series of rooms the size of a warehouse. What is this place? Sakura asked so softly that she doubted Shino would hear. But he did. They say that during the Third War, he murmured, they had Doton users create a series of hidden fortifications all throughout the Land of Fire. The location is odd, but perhaps this is one of them. When the war ended, no record of their locations were ever made public. And likely they didn't find it necessary to maintain the ones in non-critical positions. And then there was no more conversation as they traversed the ceilings, hearing the conversation of the bandits from the third chamber of the complex. Sakura retrieved one of her canisters from her vest, but Shino's hand descended on her wrist. There was just enough light to make out him shaking his head, and she realized that in chambers like these, with unknown and likely limited ventilation, her partner wouldn't be able to provide support. But that wasn't what he had in mind, she discovered as he inched closer. Let me secure the room with the swarm first, he murmured. They can prevent escape and hasten the collapse of our targets. Sakura nodded and couldn't help a shiver as her closeness allowed her to feel when Shino's swarm poured from sleeves and pockets, a huge mass of softly rustling elytron that swept like an ominous cloud into the next room. She waited patiently for Shino's signal, securing her gas mask and combat glasses, sealing the second. Her sleeping gas mixture was isoflurane-based, the cheapest and most generally available inhalational anesthetic except for the flammable ethers that were still fairly popular for situations that carried less of a risk of sparks. Though that might have seen a quick end to the bandit problem, even if it made her stomach twinge at the thought. She didn't expect it to actually put anyone to sleep if she increased the concentration, or if the room was significantly smaller than this one. She was running the risk of outright death on the part of the bandits because the invention of a safe sleeping solution was something that would make someone's fortune, but she did expect it to significantly relax muscles and reduce reaction time. When Shino's signal came, her reaction was instant, pitching in the canister and herself only seconds later. One hand swept to a blunted kunai while she kept the other one free, and the following minutes were a blur of limbs and weapons in action. They weren't good enough to sell their skill as mercenaries, for all their having learned to hide their trail. That was Sakura's first irreverent thought as her opponents tried to combat both gas and a winged enemy that was feasting on their chakra, leaving them with only sluggish weapon and hand-to-hand skills. It was the first mission in which Sakura felt that the Academy's training was more than adequate, though it was tricky to navigate through the sheer number of opponents. The blunted kunai disappeared from use as she used both hands to fix zip ties on a downed opponent, shifting to avoid the clumsy strikes of another bandit, whose hand she caught and secured in the instant after the first was secured. It was a pattern that continued until all of the bandits were captured, though the shallow, erratic breathing of a few of them were enough to make her nervous. All that remained was for them to do after that was to send for the police, Shino sprinting off while Sakura used her chakra-enhanced strength to get the men up out of the bunker, their spoils following them up by the time the local authorities had arrived to take custody of them. At least 2 required immediately medical attention, but Sakura's guilt was tempered by the knowledge that part of the responsibility lay with Shino's chakra-hungry beetles and the irrefutable fact that it had been the easiest, quickest, cleanest way to deal with the problem. She wouldn't even have any new facial scars to show for it, though one lucky bandit had opened up a long gash on her arm. They reported their success to Jun-san, who rewarded them with a fantastic dinner and a night at Miyako Azure. Sakura had a chance to tease Ino, who was obviously eyeing a handsome blue-haired apprentice chef, and enjoy a long, relaxing bath. By the time she woke the next morning, in a clean, fluffy futon which smelled like fresh herbs, she was almost giddy with the success of the whole thing. All the bandits had survived the night, no one had gotten badly hurt, even if Ino had bruised, and she had a commemorative photo that featured the 4 girls in yukata around a table spread with a course of their kaisuke dinner, 2 on either side of the coat-clad Abarame. That feeling of triumph buoyed her all the way back to Konoha, where they delivered their report directly to a grim-faced Tsunade-sama. When she'd dismissed the others, asking Sakura to stay behind, the frisson of unease that had prickled the back of Sakura's neck when they'd been directed to the office of the Hokage transmuted to a full-body chill. Yesterday, Uchiha Sasuke defected to Otagakure. Check the description for the links to the author.